Hi guys! Tonight we find ourselves standing at the edge of a narrow stretch of water where the world feels both vast and quietly contained at the same time. The night has already settled in. Above you the sky is deep and open, scattered with soft points of light that seem to rest rather than shine. The moon hangs low, casting a pale reflection across the surface of the water. It does not sparkle or flash. It simply rests there, stretched gently across the slow movement of the sea. You take a few steps forward and the ground beneath your feet shifts from firm earth to something softer. Sand, slightly cool now that the day has passed, presses lightly under your weight. A faint breeze moves across the shoreline, carrying with it the familiar scent of salt and distant minerals, a scent that has lingered here for thousands of years. The water in front of you is not wide, at least not in the way an open ocean might feel. It narrows the horizon, bringing the opposite shore closer than you might expect. And yet even in its narrowness there is a quiet sense of importance here. Something about this place feels connected to far more than what you can see. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. There is something quietly comforting about knowing that people everywhere are sharing this same calm moment. Now dim the lights and let your attention settle gently into the rhythm of this place. You stand still for a moment longer, and as your eyes adjust, you begin to notice movement out on the water. At first it is subtle, just faint shapes darker than the sea around them. Then slowly they take form. Ships, not rushing, not crowded, just moving one after another in a steady and patient flow. Some are large, their silhouettes broad and steady. Others are smaller, slipping quietly between them. None of them draw attention to themselves. They simply move as if following a rhythm that has been set long before this night began. This narrow waterway, known today as the Strait of Hormuz, has long served as a passage between larger bodies of water, linking the Persian Gulf to the open sea beyond. It may seem like a simple stretch of water at first glance, but for centuries it has quietly carried goods, people and stories between distant regions. Even in ancient times, before modern navigation systems or large industrial ships, this route was already active. Small wooden vessels guided by stars and coastal landmarks move through these same waters, carrying items like spices, textiles and ceramics. Trade did not happen quickly. It unfolded over weeks and months, shaped by weather currents and human patience. You can almost imagine those earlier journeys now. The sound of wooden hulls gently pressing against the water, the soft creak of rope under tension, the quiet conversations of Chulair, who'd grown used to long stretches of silence broken only by the wind and the sea. There is something reassuring in that image. A reminder that movement here has always been steady rather than sudden. At the same time, there are details about these early voyages that often go unnoticed. For example, many sailors who passed through this region would carry small personal items, not for trade but for comfort. Simple things like carved wooden charms or pieces of cloth from home tucked away in corners of the ship. These objects did not hold economic value, but they carried something just as important. A sense of familiarity in a place defined by constant movement. Some researchers suggest that these small personal rituals helped sailors maintain a sense of calm during long and uncertain journeys, while others believe they were tied more closely to local spiritual practices connected to the sea. The exact reasons are not always clear, but the presence of these objects appears again and again in archaeological findings along ancient coastal routes. You shift your gaze back to the present and the scene remains calm. The ships continue to pass. They do not hurry, they do not pause. They simply move one after another, creating a pattern that feels almost predictable. A quiet procession that has likely continued in some form for thousands of years. Today the scale is different, of course. The vessels are larger. The systems that guide them are more advanced. Modern navigation relies on satellites, communication networks, and carefully coordinated routes. What once depended on stars and memory now depends on signals and screens. And yet, despite all of that change, the experience from where you stand feels surprisingly similar. Water moving gently, shapes drifting across the horizon, the soft sound of waves touching the shore. It's easy to think of global trade as something complex and fast-paced, filled with numbers and urgency. But here in this quiet moment it feels different, slower, more continuous, less about speed and more about flow. You take a few steps along the shoreline, following the curve of the land as it meets the water. The sand shifts again beneath your feet, and a small line of foam traces the edge where sea and shore meet. It comes and goes in a steady rhythm, never quite the same, but never unfamiliar either. There are, of course, wider contexts that shape what happens here. This region has long been a meeting point for different cultures, economies, and systems of organization. Goods from inland areas would travel across deserts by caravan, eventually reaching coastal ports. From there, they would be loaded onto ships and carried across the water to other regions. This blending of land and sea routes created a kind of layered movement, one that did not rely on a single path but on many interconnected ones. Scholars remain divided on how early these systems became fully organized. Some believe that structured trade networks formed quite early, supported by emerging states and local authorities. Others suggest that for long periods trade here remained more informal, guided by the relationships and local knowledge rather than centralized systems. Either way, the result was the same. Movement continued, connection formed, and this narrow stretch of water remained quietly at the center of it all. You pause again, looking out across the strait. The ships are still there, still moving, still following that same steady rhythm. And as you stand here with the night settled around you and the sound of the water gently filling the space, it becomes clear that this place is not defined by any single moment. It is defined by the simple repeated act of movement from one side to the other. And tonight you are simply here to observe it, to feel it, to let it carry your thoughts slowly without urgency into the quiet rhythm it has always held. You remain by the shoreline, and after a while the quiet begins to feel familiar rather than new. The sound of the water no longer draws your attention in the same way. It becomes something steady in the background, like a slow breath that never quite stops. Out across the strait the movement continues. One ship passes, then another follows at a distance that feels carefully spaced, though no one nearby seems to be guiding it. The pattern is subtle, almost invisible, but it is there. A quiet order that reveals itself only if you take the time to notice. You walk a little further along the shore, your steps unhurried. The sand gives way in places to small stones smoothed by years of contact with water. They shift slightly under your feet, creating a soft, uneven rhythm with each step. As you move, your awareness widens. This narrow passage in front of you may appear calm and simple, but it connects places that are far beyond what your eyes can reach tonight. To one side lies the Persian Gulf, surrounded by coastlines, where people have lived, traded and adapted for thousands of years. On the other side, the water opens outward, eventually leading into wider seas that connect to distant continents. It is a small space, but it holds a large role. Even in earlier periods of history, long before modern infrastructure, this connection mattered. Goods did not stay where they were produced. They moved. Slowly, carefully, but consistently, items like dates, woven fabrics, metals would travel from inland settlements to coastal ports, then across this narrow waterway to other regions. It was not a single journey, but part of a longer chain. You imagine a merchant perhaps centuries ago standing not far from where you are now. He watches a vessel being prepared, its cargo loaded piece by piece. There is no rush. Each item is placed with care, balanced against the movement of the sea that will come later. The pace is patient. Today things move more quickly in terms of technology, but the overall rhythm still carries that same sense of continuity. Ships still arrive, pass through, and continue on their way. The difference is not in the movement itself, but in the systems that support it. Modern navigation relies on coordinated routes that guide vessels through safe paths. Communication systems allow ships to share their positions, adjusting slightly to maintain distance and flow. It may seem complex from a technical perspective, but from where you stand it appears simple. Just a steady light of movement. There is a quiet balance to it. If too many ships arrived at once, the space would feel crowded. If too few passed through, it would feel empty. But what you see now feels somewhere in between, a consistent presence that never overwhelms the senses. You pause and look more closely at the water. The surface shifts gently, reflecting the faint light above. Occasionally a ripple spreads outward, disturbed by something unseen below, perhaps a changing current, perhaps a small movement beneath the surface. It is difficult to tell. These waters are not so still even when they appear calm. Currents move quietly through this narrow space, influenced by tides and temperature differences between connected bodies of water. Early sailors learned to read these subtle patterns, often without written guides. They observed how the water behaved at different times of day, how the wind interacted with the surface, how certain areas felt slightly different as a boat passed through them. This knowledge was rarely recorded in formal ways. Instead, it was passed from one person to another through experience and shared stories. A lesser-known detail about these early navigators is how they used not just sight but also sound. Some accounts suggest that sailors could listen to the way water moved against the hull to sense changes in depth or current. It was not an exact method, but it added another layer of awareness in a time when tools were limited. Some researchers suggest that this kind of sensory navigation was more advanced than we often assume, while others believe it was more intuitive and less precise. The truth likely sits somewhere in between, shaped by both skill and familiarity. You continue walking, and the shoreline curves gently, revealing a slightly different angle of the strait. From here, the ships appear to move more directly across your field of view. Their motion becomes easier to follow. Each one carries something unseen, cargo that may have begun its journey far inland or perhaps across another sea entirely. Goods that will be unloaded somewhere else, continuing their movement through markets, warehouses, and eventually into daily life. It is easy to forget how much of everyday life depends on this kind of quiet movement. Objects that feel ordinary often have long and complex paths behind them. And yet those paths unfold without drawing attention to themselves. Just like this. You notice a faint light on one of the ships as it passes. Not bright, just enough to mark its presence. It reflects softly on the water, stretching into a thin line that breaks and reforms with each small wave. Lanterns once served a similar purpose. Before electric system, ships relied on simple lights to signal their position at night. These lights were not only practical but also comforting. A small glow in the distance could mean the difference between uncertainty and direction. Today the lights are more consistent, more reliable, but the feeling remains similar, a quiet reassurance in the dark. There are of course larger systems at work beyond what you can see. This passage is observed, monitored and guided in ways that are designed to keep everything moving smoothly. Not in a forceful or visible way, but in a steady and continuous presence. A kind of quiet watching that allows the flow to continue without interruption. Instead of thinking about it as control, it feels more like care, like someone keeping an eye on something important, not to change it, but to ensure it remains steady. You stop walking and stand still once more. The night has deepened slightly. The air feels cooler now, brushing lightly against your skin. The scent of salt is still there, but softer, and the ships continue to pass. You do not need to count them. You do not need to measure anything. It is enough to notice the rhythm, to recognize that this narrow stretch of water is not just a place but a connection. A quiet link between distant spaces held together by movement that never fully stops. And as you stand here listening to the water and watching the slow passage of vessels in the distance, your thoughts begin to settle into that same rhythm. Unhurried, continuous, calm. You remain near the edge of the water, and as the steady movement of ships continues in the distance, your thoughts begin to drift gently backward in time. The present moment softens, the lights fade, the outlines of modern vessels become less defined in your mind, replaced instead by something simpler, something quieter. You imagine this same shoreline long before charts were drawn with precision, before engines replaced sails, before distant regions were connected by systems of communication that never sleep. The air is still familiar. The scent of salt, the soft movement of water, the faint sound of wind brushing across the surface of the sea. These things have not changed, but the people who once stood here experienced them differently. You take a slow step forward as if crossing into that earlier time. Along these coasts, small communities began to form thousands of years ago. Settlements shaped not by grand design but by necessity. People gathered where fresh water could be found, where land met sea in a way that allowed both fishing and small-scale trade. Life was not fast and it was not easy, but it followed patterns that made sense within the environment. The economic structure was simple. Most families relied on a combination of fishing, small agriculture, and occasional exchange with nearby settlements. There were no large markets yet, no organised trade networks stretching across continents. Instead, movement was local. Goods passed from one village to another, carried by foot, by animal, or by small boats that hugged the coastline. You can picture one of these early boats now. Wooden, narrow, carefully shaped by hand. It sits low in the water, moving slowly, guided more by familiarity than by formal navigation. The person guiding it does not rely on instruments. Instead, they read the shoreline, the position of the sun, the feel of the wind. It is a different kind of knowledge, one that grows over time, built from repeated journeys along the same paths. A well-established historical understanding tells us that coastal communities in this region gradually developed early maritime habits even before large-scale trade emerged. The sea was not just a boundary, it was a resource, a pathway, and sometimes a challenge that required patience and respect. But there are quieter details within this early life that are often overlooked. For example, some archaeological findings suggest that these coastal communities organised their daily routines around the tides in ways that went beyond simple fishing schedules. Certain activities such as repairing nets or preparing boats were timed to match the natural rise and fall of the water. It was not just about convenience, it was about alignment, living with the rhythm of the environment rather than trying to change it. Some researchers suggest that this close relationship with natural cycles shaped early social structures, influencing how time itself was perceived. Others believe that while the environment played a role, daily life was more flexible than we might assume, with individuals adapting as needed, rather than following strict patterns. The exact balance between structure and flexibility remains uncertain. You continue to walk slowly, and as you do, the imagined shoreline around you becomes more detailed. Simple shelters stand further inland, built from materials gathered nearby. Their shapes are modest, designed more for function than appearance. Smoke rises gently from a small figure carrying the scent of wood into the air. A few figures move quietly between tasks. There is no urgency in their movement. Everything unfolds at a pace that feels connected to the light of the day and the needs of the moment. Closer to the water, a small group prepares a boat. One person checks the edges of the hull, running their hand along the wood to feel for any irregularities. Another arranges a simple net, making small adjustments that suggest familiarity rather than instruction. There is no written guide here, no formal training, just knowledge passed through observation and repetition. You pause and watch them for a moment. There is something calming about the simplicity of it. No distant signals, no layered system. Just people, water, and the quiet understanding of how to move between them. And yet even in this simplicity, connections are already beginning to form. Goods are exchanged, even if only in small amounts. Fish traded for grains, tools exchanged for materials. Over time, these small interactions begin to link communities together, creating early patterns of movement that will eventually expand far beyond what anyone here can imagine. This is how larger systems often begin, not with a sudden change, but with many small repeated actions. You look back out toward the water. In your mind, the modern ships are gone for a moment, replaced by smaller vessels moving cautiously along the coastline. They do not cross the open water directly. Instead, they follow the land, staying within sight of familiar reference points. Safety is found in closeness. Distance brings uncertainty. There is a quiet awareness here that the sea can be both helpful and unpredictable. Weather can shift, currents can change. And without advanced tools, even a small miscalculation can lead to difficulty. That awareness shapes behaviour. Journeys are planned carefully, movements are measured. There is no reason to rush because rushing does not offer advantage in this environment. A lesser-known detail from some early coastal traditions suggests that certain journeys would begin only after small observational rituals were completed. These were not grand ceremonies, but simple acts. Watching the movement of birds, noticing the pattern of waves, listening to the wind. These moments were not seen as superstition alone, but as part of understanding the environment. Some scholars suggest these practices were early forms of environmental reading, while others believe they carried symbolic meaning tied to belief systems that are not fully understood today. You continue walking, and slowly the imagined past begins to blend with the present once again. The simple boats fade, the distant lights return. The larger ships reappear on the horizon, moving with that same steady rhythm you noticed before. And yet something feels connected between the two. Despite the differences in scale and technology and complexity, the underlying pattern remains. Movement along water, careful navigation, a quiet relationship between people and the sea. You stop once more, letting the sound of the water settle around you. It's easy to think of history as something distant, something separate from the present moment. But here, standing beside this narrow passage, it feels more like a continuous line, one that stretches back through time, carried by the same currents shaped by the same shoreline. And tonight you are simply standing at one point along that line, watching, listening, letting the steady rhythm of this place guide your thoughts a little further into calm. The quiet sense of continuity stays with you as you remain by the water, and your attention begins to settle once more into the movement of the sea itself. The past lingers gently in your thoughts, but the present returns in soft layers. The sound of the waves becomes clearer again. The distant shapes of ships regain their weight and form. And somewhere between these two moments, you begin to notice the act of travel more closely. Not just that movement happens here, but how it happens. You take a few steps closer to the shoreline, where the water reaches forward in slow, repeating motions. Each small wave stretches across the sand, pauses for just a second, then quietly retreats. It leaves behind a thin line of foam that fades almost as soon as it forms. Out beyond that gentle edge, vessels continue their passage. Tonight they seem calm, steady, almost effortless. But if you let your thoughts drift again just slightly, you begin to see how different that movement once was. In earlier times, long before engines replaced sails, every journey across this water required a kind of patience that is difficult to fully imagine today. Travel depended on forces that could not be controlled, only understood and followed. Wind, current, weather. You picture one of those early journeys now. A wooden vessel sits low in the water, its surface shaped carefully by hand, each plank fitted into place with quiet precision. A sail rises above it, catching the wind in a way that feels both simple and delicate. There is no steady hum of machinery, only the sound of fabric pulling against the air, only the quiet creak of wood responding to movement. The people on board do not rush. They cannot. Their progress depends on conditions that shift slowly, sometimes unpredictably. If the wind weakens, the journey slows. If it changes direction, adjustments must be made. There is no way to force speed into the process. So they wait when needed. They move when possible. A widely accepted historical understanding shows that early maritime travel in regions like this relied heavily on seasonal wind patterns. Sailors would plan journeys based on predictable shifts in wind direction, allowing them to move with the environment rather than against it. This created a kind of natural schedule, not written down in formal timetables, but understood through repeated experience. Certain times of year were better for departure, others were better for return, and in between there were periods of waiting, of preparation, of quiet observation. You imagine standing on the shore in that time, watching a vessel that is ready to leave but remains still, not because anything is wrong, but because the conditions are not yet right. That kind of patience shaped everything. Even trade itself unfolded differently. Goods could not be expected to arrive at exact times. Instead, communities adapted to a slower rhythm of exchange where arrival was anticipated but never guaranteed to a precise moment. Today this might feel uncertain, but at the time it was simply how things worked. There are small, often overlooked details within these journeys that reveal how people adapted to such conditions. For example, some accounts suggest that sailors would carry extra food, not just as a precaution, but as a quiet acceptance that journeys might take longer than planned. Dry grains, salted fish, simple items that could last. These were not emergency supplies in the way we might think today. They were part of the expected experience of travel. Some researchers suggest that this acceptance of delay created a different relationship with time itself, one that was less focused on precision and more on readiness. Others believe that while patience was necessary, there was still a strong desire for predictability, even if it could not always be achieved. The balance between these perspectives remains open to interpretation. You watch the water again, and for a moment it feels easier to understand that earlier pace. Nothing here moves quickly, even now. The ships in the distance glide rather than rush. Their movement is steady, controlled, almost gentle. The difference is not in the speed you see, but in the systems behind it. Modern vessels carry engines that allow them to maintain consistent motion regardless of wind. Navigation systems provide clear guidance. Communication ensures that adjustments can be made in real time. And yet from where you stand, the experience is still one of quiet movement. The same as it has always been, you shift your attention slightly to the surface of the water itself. It is never completely still. Small patterns form and dissolve constantly. Ripples cross one another, merging and separating in ways that are difficult to follow for long. Beneath the surface, unseen currents move with their own steady force, guiding everything above them in subtle ways. Early sailors learned to feel these currents even without seeing them. They would notice how a vessel responded, how it drifted slightly to one side, how its movement changed depending on its position within the water. It was a form of awareness that required time to develop. A lesser-known detail from maritime traditions suggests that experienced sailors could sometimes predict changes in current by observing floating debris or small changes in watercolour. These signs were not always obvious, but over time they became part of a shared understanding. Some scholars suggest that this observational knowledge was highly refined and passed carefully between generations, while others believe it varied widely depending on region and individual experience. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle around you. The night feels slightly deeper now, the horizon darker, the ship still visible but more distant in feeling. And as you stand here watching the steady passage continue, it becomes clear that movement through this narrow waterway has never been about speed alone. It has always been about alignment, with wind, with water, with time. Even now, with all the advancements that shape modern travel, that quiet principle remains. Not obvious, not spoken, but present. And as your thoughts follow that idea, they begin to slow once more, matching the gentle rhythm of the water in front of you. Unforced, unhurried, simply moving forward. You remain near the water, and as the steady rhythm of passing vessels continues in the distance, your attention begins to settle more fully into the land behind you. The shoreline is not just a boundary, it is a meeting place between sea and desert, between movement and stillness. You turn slightly, letting your gaze drift inland where the ground rises gently, and the air carries a different texture. The scent of salt begins to soften, replaced by something drier, warmer, shaped by earth rather than water. This is where early Persian societies found their balance, not entirely of the sea and not entirely of the land, but somewhere in between. You imagine the coastline as it might have appeared many centuries ago when small settlements began to take on more defined patterns. The structures remain simple, but there is a growing sense of organisation. Paths form between dwellings. Storage areas appear closer to the shore. Boats are no longer just individual tools, but part of a shared activity. Life becomes slightly more connected. A widely accepted understanding shows that as Persian communities developed along these coasts, their economies gradually expanded beyond subsistence. Fishing and local agriculture remained important, but exchange began to play a larger role. Goods moved not only between nearby villages, but across longer distances, linking inland regions with maritime routes. Caravans carried items such as grains, metals, and textiles across dry land landscapes, eventually reaching coastal areas like this one. From there, these goods would continue their journey by sea, passing through this narrow waterway toward other regions. It was not a sudden transformation. It unfolded slowly. You picture a quiet morning in one of these early coastal settlements. The light is soft, just beginning to rise. A few figures move between tasks, preparing for the day. One person adjusts a bundle of goods, carefully wrapping it in cloth. Another checks a rope tied to a small boat, pulling it slightly to test its strength. There is no sense of urgency, only preparation. A lesser-known detail from this period suggests that many coastal communities developed shared storage practices where goods intended for trade were kept in common spaces rather than individual homes. This made it easier to organize transport and reduce the risk of loss or damage. Some researchers believe this reflects an early form of cooperative economic behavior, while others suggest it was simply a practical response to limited space and resources. Either way, it reveals something quiet but important. Trade was not just about movement, it was about coordination. You walk slowly along the shoreline again, letting your steps follow the natural curve of the land. The water remains beside you steady and unchanged, but now it feels more connected to what lies behind you. The sea is no longer separate from daily life. It is part of it. You notice how the environment shapes behavior in subtle ways. The heat during the day encourages work to begin early and slow down by midday. The cooler hours of evening and morning become the most active times. Tasks are arranged not by strict schedules, but by the natural flow of light and temperature. Even today, this pattern might feel familiar in certain parts of the world, though modern systems often push against it. Back then, there was less resistance, more adjustment. You pause and look out across the water again. The ships continue their passage, but now you imagine them differently. Not just as isolated movements, but as part of a larger network that extends both inland and outward. Each vessel carries more than goods. It carries connection. You imagine a trader standing near the shore watching as items are loaded onto a boat. He does not see the entire journey ahead. He does not know exactly where each item will end up, but he understands his role within the process. A small part of something larger. There is something calming about that perspective. No need to oversee everything, just a quiet contribution to a shared system. At the same time, there are questions that remain unresolved about how structured these early systems truly were. Some historians suggest that local authorities may have played a role in organizing trade-setting guidelines or expectations for how goods were managed. Others argue that much of this activity remained informal, shaped by relationships and mutual understanding rather than centralized control. The evidence does not always point clearly in one direction, and perhaps that uncertainty reflects the gradual nature of change. You continue walking and the shoreline begins to feel more familiar under your feet. This sand, the small stones, the gentle slope of land meeting water. It is easy to imagine that people here long ago would have known every detail of this place, every shift in the ground, every change in the waves tide, every subtle variation in the wind. That kind of familiarity creates a sense of belonging that does not need to be spoken. It simply exists, a quiet awareness of where you are and how to move within it. A small but interesting detail from some early Persian coastal traditions suggests that certain families specialized in particular roles related to maritime life. Some focused on boat construction, refining techniques over generations. Others became known for navigation or trade coordination. This was not a formal system in the way modern professions are defined, but it created a gentle form of specialization within the community. Some researchers suggest this contributed more efficient trade over time, while others believe these roles remained fluid with individuals shifting between tasks as needed. Again, the exact structure is not fully certain, but the pattern is clear. Over time, life here became more interconnected, more layered, and yet from where you stand now, all of that complexity fades into something simple. The sound of water, the movement of ship, the quiet presence of land behind you. You take a slow breath, letting the air settle into your chest, and for a moment everything feels balanced. The sea does not overwhelm the land. The land does not resist the sea. They exist together, just as they have for centuries, and as your thoughts follow that balance, they begin to slow once more, carried gently by the steady rhythm of this place. You continue along the shoreline, and as you walk, the quiet balance between land and sea begins to reveal something more subtle. Movement does not begin here. It arrives here. From far inland beyond what you can see tonight, long routes stretch across dry landscapes shaped by footsteps, animal paths, and slow repeated journeys. These routes do not rush. They unfold, gradually connecting distant places through patience rather than speed. You imagine one of these journeys now. A caravan moves steadily across a wide open expanse. The ground is firm but uneven, marked by faint tracks that have formed over time. The air is dry, carrying only the soft sound of footsteps and the occasional shift of bundled goods. There is no clear road in the modern sense, only direction. The people travelling here do not rely on signs or markers placed along the way. Instead, they follow knowledge that has been passed from one journey to the next. Landform stars and memory guide them forward. Eventually, after many days, perhaps weeks, the landscape begins to change. The air grows softer. The scent of salt appears faint at first, then more noticeable, and the land slopes gently downward until at last the sea comes into view. You pause as if standing at that same moment. Arrival. The caravan slows not because it must, but because the journey is shifting into something new. Goods that have travelled across land will now continue across water. This meeting point between caravan and sea is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, practical. A widely recognised historical pattern shows that inland trade routes across regions connected to Persia were closely linked with maritime pathways. Caravans transported goods such as spices, textiles and metals toward coastal settlements, where they would be transferred onto ships for further movement. This process did not happen all at once. It unfolded in stages. Goods were unloaded, sorted, sometimes stored for a short time, then prepared for the next part of their journey. You imagine the scene more closely. Bundles are carefully lowered from animals and placed onto the ground. Hands move steadily, checking each item, adjusting coverings, ensuring nothing has shifted during travel. There is no rush because rushing risks damage. Nearby small boats wait. They are not yet moving, but they feel ready. A lesser-known aspect of this transition between land and sea is how much attention was given to repackaging goods. Items that travelled well on land did not always suit conditions at sea. Cloth might be tightened, containers reinforced. Some goods were divided into smaller portions to make handling easier. Some researchers suggest that these adjustments reflect an early understanding of different transport environments, while others believe they were simply learned through repeated experience after encountering small losses along the way. Either way, it shows a quiet awareness of change. The journey is not one continuous motion. It is a series of careful steps. You begin walking again, letting your thoughts move alongside this process. The shoreline becomes a place of transition, not just physically but rhythmically. The steady pace of the caravan meets the gentle movement of the sea, and somewhere between them a new pattern forms. You notice how the environment encourages this blending. The open land allows for long, steady travel. The water allows for smoother, extended movement once goods are loaded. Together they create a system that feels almost natural, not forced, not imposed, just gradually developed over time. You look out toward the water again, and the ships in the distance begin to feel like the continuation of those earlier caravans, different in form, but similar in purpose. Each vessel carries what once moved slowly across land. Each one extends a journey that began far away. There is something calming about that continuity, a sense that everything is connected, even if the connections are not always visible. At the same time, there are questions about how organized these exchanges truly were in their earlier stages. Some historians suggest that designated meeting points emerged where caravans regularly arrived and ships were prepared to receive goods. Others propose that these interactions remained more flexible, shaped by timing, relationships and opportunity rather than fixed locations. The evidence offers glimpses but not always complete clarity, and so the picture remains soft around the edges. You pause again, listening to the water. The sound is steady and tracked. It does not reveal the complexity behind these movements. It simply continues. You imagine the people involved in these exchanges. They do not think in terms of large systems or global networks. They focus on what is in front of them, securing goods, maintaining balance, preparing for the next step. There is no need to see the entire journey, only the part that belongs to them. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts of early trade practices, where individuals responsible for transferring goods between land and sea developed quiet signals to coordinate their work. Simple gestures, repeated actions understood without the need for spoken instructions. These signals helped maintain flow without creating noise or confusion. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of coordinated labour, while others suggest it was simply a practical adaptation to busy environments where clarity was needed without disruption. You take a slow breath and the cool air settles gently around you. The night feels stable. the shoreline familiar, and the movement of ships continues just as it did before, just as it has for centuries. You do not need to follow any single journey completely. It's enough to understand that each one is part of something larger. A quiet system of movement that begins far inland, passes through this narrow stretch of water, and continues outward into the wider world. And as you stand here letting that idea settle, your thoughts begin to move more slowly again, following the same pattern, step by step, without urgency, carried gently forward by the steady rhythm of land meeting sea. You continue along the shoreline, and after a while the steady rhythm of distant ships begins to blend so naturally into the background that your attention shifts elsewhere. Toward the small harbours, they appear gradually as you walk, not as large structures, but as gentle interruptions along the coast. Slight curves in the land, sheltered spaces where the water feels calmer, where movement slows even further. You step closer to one of these places. The shoreline dips inward, forming a quiet inlet. The waves here are softer, their edges less defined, as if the sea itself has decided to rest for a moment before continuing its larger journey. This is where daily life gathers. Long before large ports existed, spaces like this served as natural harbours. They did not require construction in the way modern facilities do. Instead, they were shaped by the land itself, offering protection from stronger currents and open winds. A widely accepted understanding shows that early coastal settlements depended heavily on these natural features. Harbours allowed boats to anchor safely, to be repaired, to be loaded and unloaded, without constant exposure to shifting conditions. You imagine this harbour in an earlier time. A few small vessels rest near the edge, their hulls gently rising and falling with the water. They are tied with simple ropes secured to wooden posts or stones placed carefully along the shore. There is no noise of machinery, only the soft creak of wood, only the quiet lap of water against the sides of the boats. A few figures move nearby. Their actions are steady, unhurried. One person kneels beside a net, carefully untangling its threads. Another carries a small bundle from the shore to a waiting vessel, placing it down with deliberate care. There is no sense of rush here. Everything follows the rhythm of the tide. As the water rises, boats shift slightly closer to the shore. As it falls, they settle back, revealing more of their structure. This constant movement shapes how work is done. Tasks begin and end with the water, not with the clock. You step a little closer and the scent changes again. Salt remains, but now it is mixed with something else. Wood, rope, a faint trace of fish, not unpleasant, but part of the environment. These are the quiet markers of a working harbour. A lesser-known detail from early coastal life suggests that many of these harbours had informal zones, areas understood by the community rather than marked by boundaries. Certain spaces were used for repairing boats, others for preparing goods, some for simple gathering and rest. These divisions were rarely written down, but they were followed with consistency. Some researchers suggest this reflects a shared understanding shaped by repeated use, while others believe it may have been guided by local customs that varied from place to place. The exact structure is not always clear, but the pattern of use appears again and again. You watch as one of the boats is gently pushed away from the shore. It does not depart quickly. Instead, it drifts outward, guided by careful hands and small adjustments. A pole presses lightly against the ground beneath the water, helping to steer the vessel before the sail begins to catch the wind. This moment of departure is quiet. There is no announcement, no signal beyond the movement itself, and yet it marks the continuation of a journey. You follow the boat with your eyes as it moves toward the open water, eventually blending into the wider flow of vessels passing through the strait. From this small harbour, the larger world is reached, and when those vessels return, they bring something back, not always large or dramatic, sometimes just small items, a different type of cloth, a tool shaped in a new way, a story carried quietly from one place to another. These harbours become points of exchange not just for goods, but for ideas and habits that slowly spread between regions. You continue walking along the edge of the inlet, and the ground beneath your feet feels firmer, here shaped by repeated use. Small indentations mark where people have walked before, where objects have been placed, where boats have rested. There is a sense of familiarity in these marks, a quiet record of daily life. At the same time, there are lingering questions about how organised these early harbour activities truly were. Some historians suggest that even small harbours may have had individuals who guided usage, ensuring that space was shared effectively. Others propose that these places remained largely self-regulated, with order emerging naturally through repeated interaction. The available evidence offers possibilities but not certainty. You pause once more, letting the scene settle. The harbour feels calm, contained, protected from the wider movement beyond it, and yet it is not separate. It is connected. Each small action here contributes to a larger pattern that extends far beyond the inlet. A boat leaving, another arriving, goods moving quietly from one place to another. You notice how the water inside the harbour reflects the sky more clearly than the open sea. The surface is smoother, less disturbed. The faint light above stretches across it in longer, more continuous shapes. It feels still, but not inactive, just gently held in place. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical accounts describing how boats were sometimes arranged within these harbours according to familiarity rather than strict order. Vessels belonging to certain families or groups would naturally gather in similar areas, creating subtle clusters that reflected social connections. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of community organisation within shared spaces, while others believe it was simply a result of habit and convenience. You take a slow breath and the air feels slightly warmer here, sheltered from the open breeze. The sounds are softer, the movements smaller, and as you stand beside this quiet harbour watching the gentle rise and fall of boats resting in place, your thoughts begin to settle once again. Everything here feels contained within a simple rhythm. The tide rises, the tide falls, boats come, boats go. And within that quiet repetition, life continues without urgency, shaped by the steady presence of water meeting land. You leave the shelter of the small harbour behind, and as you return to the more open stretch of shoreline, the wider rhythm of the strait gently surrounds you again. The sound of the water becomes more pronounced. The breeze returns, moving lightly across your face, carrying that familiar blend of salt and distance. Out ahead, the ships continue their quiet passage, but your attention begins to shift towards something closer. The people who live here, not the travellers passing through, but those who remain. You walk slowly, and as you do, the shoreline begins to reveal small signs of daily life. Nothing large or striking, just quiet details that speak of repetition and routine. A length of rope coiled neatly on the ground, a piece of cloth stretched between two wooden posts moving gently in the wind. A simple structure set slightly back from the shore, its surface worn smooth by time and weather. These are not objects meant to stand out. They are part of a pattern, a life shaped by consistency. A widely accepted understanding suggests that for many coastal communities along this region, daily life followed steady cycles influenced by both land and sea. Fishing, small-scale trade, maintenance of equipment and household tasks formed the core of each day. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted, each action connected to the next. You imagine a typical day unfolding here. The morning begins early while the air is still cool. People move quietly, preparing for tasks that have been repeated many times before. Nets are checked, boats are examined, small repairs are made with careful hands. There is no need for instruction. The knowledge is already there. By midday, the heat encourages a slower pace. Movement becomes more deliberate. Tasks shift toward those that can be done in shade or indoors. Conversation softens. The energy of the morning settles into something quieter. And then, as evening approaches, activity returns once more, guided by cooler air and softer light. This pattern repeats day after day, year after year. A lesser-known detail from some coastal traditions suggests that many families develop specific routines tied not only to the time of day, but to the condition of the sea itself. If the water felt unsettled even in small ways, certain activities would be delayed or adjusted. This was not based on formal measurement. It was based on familiarity. Some researchers suggest that this kind of awareness allowed communities to adapt more effectively to subtle environmental changes, while others believe it was more about comfort and habit than precise understanding. The exact reasoning is difficult to define, but the behaviour itself appears consistently in different accounts. You continue walking and the shoreline feels quieter now. less about movement, more about presence. You notice how the environment shapes not only work but rest. Simple spaces are arranged to catch the breeze. Materials are chosen for comfort as much as durability. Even the placement of objects reflects an understanding of how air, light and temperature shift throughout the day. These choices are not explained, they are lived. You pause and look out toward the water again. The ships remain in motion, distant and steady. But here, closer to the land, everything feels slower, more grounded. There is a gentle contrast between the two. Movement beyond, stillness here, and yet they are not separate. The people living along this shore depend on that distant movement just as the movement depends on the stability of places like this. You imagine someone sitting near the edge of the water at the end of a long day, their posture relaxed, their attention drifting between the sea and the land behind them. There is no urgency in their thoughts, no need to prepare for something immediate, just a quiet awareness of what has been done and what will be done again tomorrow. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical observations of coastal life, where individuals developed personal habits tied to specific places along the shore. Particular rock, a certain stretch of sand, a shaded area near the water. These spots became part of their routine, not marked, not claimed, just known. Some researchers interpret this as a reflection of how people form subtle attachments to their environment, while others suggest it may have practical origin, such as choosing locations that offer the best conditions for rest or observation. Either way, it adds another layer to the quiet rhythm of life here. You take a slow breath, letting the air move in and out without effort. The night continues to deepen, but not in a way that feels heavy. It simply settles, the sounds soften, the light fades, and the steady movement of the sea continues without interruption. At the same time, there are questions that remain about how much these routines changed over longer periods. Some historians suggest that while the surface of daily life appears consistent, gradual shifts in trade and technology may have subtly altered these patterns over generations. Others believe that the core rhythm remained remarkably stable even as the wider world changed. The evidence offers possibilities but not final answers. You remain where you are, letting that uncertainty rest without needing to resolve it. Because here in this quiet moment, what matters is not the exact structure of the past. It is the feeling of continuity, the sense that life in its simplest form follows patterns that do not need to be rushed or explained. You look once more at the water where the ships continue their steady passage, then back to the shoreline where everything feels still. And somewhere between those two, your thoughts begin to slow again, settling gently into the same quiet rhythm that has shaped this place for centuries. You continue along the shoreline, and after some time, the quiet presence of the sea begins to feel even more expansive. The harbour is now behind you. The small traces of daily life soften into the distance, and ahead the open water stretches wider, carrying with it a different kind of feeling. Not busier, just broader. You pause, letting your gaze rest on the horizon where the faint shapes of ships move steadily from one side to the other. They are still calm, still measured, but now they seem slightly more distant, as if they belong to something larger than the quiet space you have been walking through. And in a way they do. You begin to sense the presence of distant powers, not as something immediate or overwhelming, but as something that exists quietly beyond the edges of this place. Long ago, as trade routes expanded and connections between regions grew stronger, larger societies began to take notice of this narrow passage, not in a sudden or forceful way, but gradually as the flow of goods and movement revealed its importance. Empires, kingdoms, and regional authorities all became aware that this slender stretch of water linked many parts of the world. Yet here, standing by the shore, that awareness does not feel heavy. It feels distant. You imagine the coastline during a time when larger political entities began to form across the region. Messages would travel slowly, carried by riders or ships. Decisions made far inland might eventually influence what happened along these shores, but the connection was not immediate. Time created space between intention and effect. This allowed daily life here to continue with a certain independence. A commonly accepted view among historians suggests that while major empires such as the Achaemenid Persian Empire developed extensive administrative systems, their direct presence along smaller coastal areas could be uneven. Some regions were closely connected to central authority, while others remained more locally guided. This created a layered experience. From a distance, there was structure. Up close, there was flexibility. You picture a traveller arriving from a distant inland city carrying news or instructions shaped by a larger system. When they reach the coast, they find a place that does not resist those influences, but does not fully change because of them either. Life continues. Boats move. Goods are exchanged. The rhythm remains steady. A lesser-known aspect of this period involves how information itself travelled along these routes. Alongside goods, messages were often carried informally passed between traders, sailors and travellers. These messages were not always official. Sometimes they were simple updates, stories or observations about conditions in other regions. In this way, knowledge spread gradually shaped by the conversation rather than formal record. Some researchers suggest that this informal exchange of information played a significant role in maintaining connections between distant areas, while others believe its impact was limited compared to structured communication systems that developed later. The full extent of its influence is difficult to measure. You take a few slow steps forward and the ground beneath your feet feels slightly firmer now, less interrupted by small stones. The shoreline here is smoother shaped by the consistent contact with the water. The sea itself reflects the sky in long dark stretches broken only by the soft movement of waves. And out there the ships continue their quiet passage. They do not carry visible signs of the larger systems that may be connected to them. No flags that you can clearly see. No markings that stand out in the night. From this distance they are simply part of the flow, and that is how they feel. Part of something continuous. Not defined by power or control, but by presence. You imagine sailors on one of those vessels, aware in a general sense that they are part of a larger network, but focused mainly on their immediate surroundings. The feel of the deck beneath their feet, the sound of water moving alongside the hull, the position of the shoreline as it slowly shifts with their movement. Their experience is not abstract. It is direct. Grounded in what they can see and feel. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical observations where sailors moving through regions influenced by larger empires would sometimes adopt small elements of different cultures, a particular style of knot a phrase in another language, a way of preparing food. These changes were subtle, not imposed. They emerged through contact. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of gradual cultural blending along trade routes, while others suggest that such influences remained limited, with local traditions maintaining a strong presence despite outside contact. The balance between these perspectives remains open. You stop once more, letting your attention settle. The night is calm, the air moves gently, and the water continues its steady motion. It becomes clear that while larger forces may exist beyond this place, they do not define the experience of standing here. They exist in the background, soft, distant, almost like the horizon itself, visible but far away. What remains close is the rhythm, the quiet movement of ships, the steady presence of the shoreline, the simple act of watching and listening. And as your thoughts follow that simplicity, they begin to settle once again, moving away from larger ideas and returning to something smaller, something closer. Just the sound of the water, just the gentle passage of vessels in the distance. Just this moment held quietly between land and sea. You remain by the shoreline, and as the quiet presence of distant influences fades back into the background, your attention begins to return to something softer. The night itself, it has deepened without you noticing. The sky feels wider now. The stars more settled, their light steady rather than bright. The moon has shifted slightly, casting a longer reflection across the water, stretching farther toward the shore where you stand. The surface of the sea holds that light gently. It does not sparkle or flicker, it carries it. Out across the strait the ships continue their movement, but now their presence is marked more clearly by small points of light. Each vessel carries its own quiet glow, steady and contained, helping it remain visible in the darkness. These lights do not compete with one another, they simply exist. You watch one of them for a moment, noticing how its reflection forms a thin line across the water, breaking softly with each passing ripple. It moves slowly, not drawing attention but always present. This quiet use of light has a long history. Before modern navigation systems, sailors relied on simple visual signals to guide their movement at night. Lanterns were placed carefully not just for visibility but to communicate position and direction to others nearby. Over time, these practices became more refined. A widely recognized development in maritime history shows that systems of standardized lighting gradually emerged, allowing vessels to identify one another more clearly and avoid confusion. Different positions and colors of light came to represent specific meanings, helping to maintain order even in darkness. From where you stand, those systems feel almost invisible. You do not need to understand their details to sense their effect. Everything moves smoothly, quietly, without interruption. You take a few steps along the water's edge and the sound of your movement blends with the gentle rhythm of the sea. The air feels cooler now, brushing lightly against your skin, carrying a faint trace of moisture. It is the kind of air that encourages stillness. You imagine an earlier night along this same coastline. The absence of modern lighting makes the darkness deeper, more complete. The horizon disappears almost entirely, leaving only the faint outline of water against sky. In that setting, even a small lantern would feel significant, a point of certainty in an otherwise open space. A lesser-known detail from historical accounts suggests that sailors sometimes adjusted the brightness of their lanterns depending on conditions. On especially dark nights, they might shield the light slightly to preserve their own night vision while still remaining visible to others. This careful balance reflects a deeper awareness of how light interacts with both environment and perception. Some researchers suggest that such practices required a high level of experience and judgment, while others believe they were simple habits developed through repeated exposure to similar conditions. Either way, they reveal a quiet sensitivity to the night. You stop again and look out across the strait. The pattern of lights continues, not perfectly aligned, not symmetrical, but steady, each one moving along its path, guided by systems you cannot see yet clearly working. There is something calming about that, a sense that even in darkness there is structure, not imposed loudly, just present. You shift your attention to the shoreline itself. Closer to you, the water reflects less light, appearing darker, more solid. Small waves move in and out their edges, barely visible, defined more by sound than sight. You listen, the soft wash of water, the faint movement of wind, the distant hum of something far away, perhaps from one of the larger vessels carried across the surface in fragments. It all blends together. No single sound stands out. Everything feels balanced. At the same time, there are questions about how early sailors interpreted the night sky in relation to navigation through places like this. Some historians suggest that stars played a consistent role in guiding direction, even in narrower waterways. Others propose that along coastlines such as this, one visual reference to land may have been more important than celestial navigation. The available evidence points in both directions depending on time period and context. You let that uncertainty remain. It does not need to be resolved. What matters here is the experience, the quiet act of moving through darkness with just enough light to guide the way. A small but interesting detail appears in some traditions where sailors gave informal names to certain patterns of light along the coast or among ships. These names were not official, but they helped create familiarity, turning an otherwise uniform night into something more recognizable. Some researchers interpret this as a way of making navigation more personal and less abstract, while others see it simply as a natural tendency to name and remember. You take a slow breath and the cool night air settles deeper into your lungs. The world feels quieter now. More contained. The movement of ships continues, but it feels softer, less noticeable, as if it has become part of the background. And the light. Always the light. Small. Stay. Unchanging. It carries across the water, connecting one point to another without drawing attention to itself. And as you stand here watching those distant lights move slowly through the darkness, your thoughts begin to follow them. Not quickly, not with focus, but gently, drifting from one point to another, guided by the same quiet rhythm that has shaped this place for centuries. You remain by the water, and after some time, the quiet glow of distant lights begins to fade into something more subtle. Not because they disappear, But because your attention shifts again, this time towards something less visible, the movement beneath the surface, you take a slow step closer to the edge where the water reaches out in soft, repeating motions. It looks calm, almost still, but as you watch more carefully, you begin to notice small variations. The way one ripple crosses another, the slight change in direction as a wave returns, the faint sense that the water is always moving even when it appears not to be. This is where a different kind of knowledge begins. Not written, not easily explained, but deeply understood by those who spend their lives here. Long before modern instrument sailors relied on careful observation of currents and wind patterns to guide their journeys. These forces were not always visible, but they could be felt through the behavior of the vessel, the texture of the water, the movement of the air. A commonly accepted understanding shows that in narrow waterways like this, one currents can shift depending on tides and the interaction between connected bodies of water. These shifts may seem small, but over time they shape how vessels move. Early sailors learned to recognize these patterns, not through calculation, but through experience. You imagine standing on a boat in that earlier time. The shoreline remains within sight, but the water beneath you carries a quiet force. You feel it in the way the vessel drifts slightly, even when the sail is still. You notice how certain areas feel smoother while others create a gentle resistance. There is no clear boundary, just a gradual change. A lesser-known detail from maritime traditions suggests that some experienced sailors developed personal ways of describing these currents using simple terms that reflected how the water felt rather than how it behaved in measurable terms. They might speak of the water as heavy or light, as pulling or releasing. These descriptions were not scientific, but they were meaningful within the context of daily life. Some researchers suggest that this kind of language helped pass knowledge more effectively between generations, while others believe it may have limited precision compared to later navigational methods. The balance between clarity and simplicity remains open to interpretation. You continue to watch the water, letting your eyes follow the movement without trying to define it. There is no need to name every change. It is enough to notice that change is always happening. You lift your gaze slightly and now the wind becomes more noticeable. It moves gently across the surface, shaping the water in small, consistent ways. The direction is not strong, but it is steady, creating a pattern that stretches outward, influencing everything it touches. Wind and water work together here. Not always in obvious ways, but always connected. You imagine sailors learning to read both at once. The angle of the sail, the feel of the air against their skin, the response of the boat as it moves forward. This kind of awareness does not come quickly. It builds slowly through repeated experience. Mistakes are part of the process. Adjustments follow, and over time understanding deepens. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors would sometimes test the wind by lifting small pieces of cloth or loose fibers into the air, watching how they move before making decisions about direction. These simple actions provided immediate feedback, allowing for small corrections without needing complex tools. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of practical ingenuity, while others see it as a natural extension of observation in an environment where subtle changes matter. You take a slow breath and the air feels slightly cooler now. The night continues to settle. The sounds remain soft, the movement steady, and beneath it all these unseen forces continue their quiet work. At the same time, there are ongoing discussions about how consistent these patterns were across different periods. Some historians suggest that knowledge of local currents became highly refined in regions with long-standing maritime activity. Others propose that variability in conditions meant that even experienced sailors had to remain flexible, adapting constantly rather than relying on fixed expectations. The evidence offers both possibilities, and perhaps both are true in different moments. You remain still, letting that thought pass without needing to hold on to it, because here what matters is not the exact nature of these patterns. It is the feeling they create, a sense that beneath the visible surface there is always movement, always interaction. Always a quiet balance between forces that shape the path forward. You look once more across the strait. The ships continue to pass steady and calm, guided not only by visible routes but by these deeper patterns that cannot be seen from where you stand. And as your attention follows that idea, your thoughts begin to slow again, not focusing on details, not trying to understand everything, just drifting, like the water itself, moving gently guided by forces you do not need to name. You remain by the shoreline, and after a while your attention begins to drift away from the movement of water and wind towards something more grounded. The quiet spaces where goods arrive, where they rest, even if only briefly. You take a few slow steps inland, following a faint path that leads away from the immediate edge of the sea. The sound of the waves softens behind you, becoming a distant rhythm rather than a constant presence. Ahead, the land feels more still, more settled. This is where exchange begins to take shape in a different way, not through motion, but through pause. You imagine a simple trading spool forming here. Not a large market, not a crowded centre, but an open area where goods are gathered, arranged, and quietly observed. The ground is worn slightly from repeated use. Small indentations suggest where items have been placed over time. Bundles rest in loose groupings, some wrapped in cloth, others contained in simple wooden structures. There is no display in the modern sense, no effort to attract attention. Everything is placed with purpose but without urgency. A commonly accepted understanding shows that as trade expanded through regions connected to the Persian Gulf, small coastal exchange points gradually evolved into more regularized markets. These spaces allowed goods arriving by land and sea to be sorted, assessed, and prepared for further movement. But here in this quieter stage, the process remains simple. You picture a few individuals moving through this space. They do not rush from one task to another. They move steadily, stopping occasionally to examine an item, to adjust a covering, to shift a bundle slightly to one side. There is a sense of familiarity in their actions. They know what belongs here. They know what will move next. A lesser known detail from some early trading practices suggests that goods were often arranged not only by type, but by origin. Items from inland regions might be grouped together, while those arriving by sea would form separate clusters. This made it easier to track where things had come from, even without written records. Some researchers suggest that this method helped maintain clarity in increasingly complex exchanges, while others believe it was simply a natural outcome of how goods arrived and were handled. Either way, it reflects a quiet awareness of connection. Each object carries the path behind it. You walk slowly along the edge of this imagined space, letting your attention rest on the details. A piece of woven fabric, its texture soft but durable. A small container shaped carefully to hold its contents securely. A bundle tied with rope, the knots firm but not overly tight. Each item feels complete in itself, and yet none of them are meant to stay. They're all part of movement. You pause for a moment, noticing how the air feels different here, less influenced by the sea, warmer. Still, the scent of salt lingers faintly, but it is mixed now with earth and material, with the quiet presence of objects that have travelled far to arrive here. You imagine a quiet exchange taking place, not loud bargaining, not hurried negotiation, just a conversation measured and calm. Hands gesture gently, voices remain low. Agreements form not in sudden decisions, but through gradual understanding. This slower pace shapes everything. Time is not compressed. It stretches, allowing each step to unfold naturally. At the same time, there are questions about how structured these early trading interactions truly were. Some historians suggest that even in these simple spaces, there may have been informal rules guiding exchange understood by those who participated. Others believe that transactions were more flexible, shaped by trust, familiarity, and repeated interaction, rather than defined systems. The evidence does not always provide clear answers, and so the picture remains open. You continue walking, and the space begins to feel less like a single location and more like part of a larger pattern. Goods arrive. They rest. They move on. The process repeats, day after day, without needing to be directed from above. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical observations where traders would sometimes leave small marks on containers or bundles, not as formal labels but as personal identifiers. A simple symbol, a pattern, a way of recognizing what belonged to whom. These marks were not standardized. They varied from person to person. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of identification within growing trade systems, while others suggest it was simply a practical habit that made handling goods easier. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness of this space settle around you. The noise of the sea is distant now, the movement of ships no longer visible from where you stand. And yet you know they are still there, continuing their passage. Carrying goods like these across the water, You look back slightly as if sensing that connection, and it becomes clear that this quiet place, this simple gathering of objects, is not separate from the larger flow. It is part of it, a moment of pause within a longer journey, and as your thoughts follow that Aegea, they begin to slow once more, resting just as these goods do, not stopping completely, but settling, waiting, before continuing on. You remain near the quiet trading space for a moment longer, then slowly turn back towards the shoreline, where the sound of the sea begins to return in gentle layers. As you walk, the sense of stillness follows you, but now it blends with movement again. Not the broad distance from the movement of ships. Something more subtle, more structured. You step closer to the water, and as the horizon comes back into view, you begin to notice how each vessel seems to follow a path that feels almost guided, even though no guiding presence is visible. They do not randomly. They do not drift without direction. Instead, there is a quiet order to their movement, a pattern that reveals itself only if you watch long enough. You pause and let your eyes follow one ship as it moves through the strait. Keeps a steady course, maintaining a gentle distance from others nearby. Another vessel appears further back, following a similar line, not too close, not too far. It feels natural, but it's not accidental. A widely recognized development over time is that waterways like this one gradually became more organized in how vessels move through them. As the number of ships increased, simple methods of coordination began to emerge, helping to reduce confusion and maintain steady flow. These methods were not always formal. At first, they relied on observation, experience, and shared understanding. You imagine an earlier period when ships approaching this narrow passage would adjust their movement based on what they could see ahead. If one vessel was already passing through a certain path, another might wait or shift slightly to maintain space. No signals were required, just awareness. A lesser-known detail from maritime traditions suggests that sailors sometimes use small visual cues, such as the angle of a sail or the position of a boat relative to the shoreline, to communicate intention without words. These signals were subtle. They did not stand out. But for those who understood them, they carried meaning. Some researchers suggest that this kind of nonverbal coordination played an important role in maintaining flow through busy waterways, while others believe its effectiveness depended heavily on local familiarity and experience. The exact extent of its use is not fully clear. You continue watching the ships, and over time the pattern becomes easier to notice. There is a sense of spacing, a quiet rhythm of approach and passage. Each vessel seems to know where it belongs. Not because it has been told directly, but because it follows a shared logic that has developed over time. This is how order often forms, not through strict instruction, but through repeated practice. You take a few slow steps along the water's edge, letting your feet follow the soft line where sea meets land. The sand feels cooler now, the night air settling more deeply around you. The sound of the water remains steady, unchanged, and yet the movement beyond it feels slightly more defined. More intentional. You imagine how this quiet coordination might have evolved. As more ships began to pass through this narrow space, the need for clarity would have grown. Not in a loud or urgent way, but gradually as small adjustments became necessary. Perhaps certain routes became preferred. Perhaps certain times felt easier for passage. These patterns, once established, would be repeated, refined, passed along through experience. At the same time, there is ongoing discussion about how formal these systems became in earlier periods. Some historians suggest that local authorities or experienced navigators may have influenced how movement was organized, offering guidance to those less familiar with the passage. Others believe that much of this order remained informal, shaped by shared habits rather than structured rules. The available evidence allows for both possibilities, and perhaps both existed at different times. You stop again, letting your attention settle. The ships continue to pass, one after another, each following a path that feels both individual and connected. There is no sense of competition, no urgency, just steady movement. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors entering narrow waterways would sometimes slow their pace slightly, not out of necessity, but as a way of aligning with the movement around them. This adjustment helped create a smoother overall flow, reducing the need for sudden changes. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of cooperative navigation, while others see it simply as a practical response to shared space. You take a slow breath and the cool air moves gently through your chest. The night feels settled, the horizon calm, and the quiet order of movement continues without interruption. It becomes clear that even in a place defined by constant passage, there is a sense of balance, a way of moving that does not disturb the stillness around it. And as you stand here watching that quiet coordination unfold across the water, your thoughts begin to follow the same pattern. Not rushing, not wandering, just moving gently from one moment to the next, guided not by urgency, served by rhythm. You remain near the water, and after watching the steady passage of ships for some time, your attention begins to drift once more, this time toward the people who move with those vessels. Not the shoreline communities, not the traders unmarked. But the sailors themselves, the ones who spend long stretches of time between places. You follow the movement of a single ship as it glides across the strait, and for a moment you imagine what it feels like to be on board. The ground beneath your feet shifts gently, not enough to unsettle you, just enough to remind you that you are no longer standing on solid land. The sound of water is constant but different here, closer, more immediate. You can hear it brushing against the sides of the vessel, rising and falling in a steady rhythm that becomes familiar over time. Life at sea is not dramatic. It is repetitive. Days unfold in patterns that rarely change. A widely accepted understanding shows that for many sailors throughout history, daily routines were carefully structured to maintain both the vessel and the well-being of those on board. Tasks were divided into shifts, ensuring that someone was always aware of the surroundings, even during the quietest hours. These routines were not rushed. They were steady. You imagine a typical day of sea. The morning begins with simple checks. Ropes are inspected, sails adjusted. The condition of the vessel is observed with quiet attention. There is no need for urgency because everything's done regularly. Nothing is left to chance. As the day continues, time stretches. There are moments of activity followed by long periods of calm. Sailors move between tasks and rest their energy, shaped by the slow pace of travel. Conversations are soft, often brief. Silence is common but not uncomfortable. It becomes part of the environment. A lesser-known detail from maritime life suggests that sailors often developed small personal routines to mark the passing of time. Without clear boundaries between one day and the next, these habits helped create a sense of structure. Some might repeat a simple task at the same moment each day. Others might pause at certain points to observe the horizon or adjust their position on the deck. These actions were not required. They were chosen. Some researchers suggest that such routines provided a sense of stability in an environment where surroundings changed constantly, while others believe they were simply natural habits formed through repetition. You let that idea settle as you continue to imagine the scene. The ship moves steadily. The horizon shifts slowly. The shoreline appears, then fades, then appears again at a different angle. Time feels different here, less divided, more continuous. You notice how the body adapts to this environment. Balance becomes instinctive. Movement adjusts to the gentle motion beneath your feet. Even rest changes. Sleep is lighter, shaped by the subtle sounds and shifts of the vessel. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical accounts describing how sailors learned to wake easily to changes in the movement of the ship. A slight difference in rhythm, a shift in sound, could signal that something required attention. This awareness developed over time. It was not taught directly. It emerged through experience. Some researchers interpret this as a form of heightened sensitivity to the environment, while others suggest it was simply a necessary adaptation to life at sea. You take a slow breath, imagining the air on deck. It carries the scent of salt more strongly here, mixed with the faint presence of wood rope and the materials that make up the vessel itself. The wind moves freely, unobstructed, touching everything with equal softness. And always the water, constant, unbroken. You look again at the ship moving across the strait. From where you stand, it appears simple. A shape, a light, a steady path. But within it, there is a world of small routines, quiet habits, and lived experience that unfolds day after day. At the same time, there are questions about how varied these experiences were across different periods and types of vessels. Some historians suggest that larger ships with more structured crews developed more defined routines, while smaller vessels may have relied on more flexible patterns. Others believe that despite differences in scale, the core rhythm of life at sea remained similar. The evidence offers different perspectives, and perhaps each one reflects a different moment in time. You remain still, letting the imagined movement of the ship blend back into the distant reality in front of you. The vessel continues its passage. The light remains steady. The rhythm does not change. And as you stand here feeling the quiet connection between land and sea, between observer and traveller, your thoughts begin to slow once more, carried gently by the same steady motion. Not fixed, not hurried, just moving forward one calm moment at a time. You remain by the shoreline, and as the image of life aboard the ship slowly settles into the background, your attention returns to the vessels themselves. Not just how they move, but how they have changed. You look out across the strait, watching one ship pass, then another, each shaped in a way that feels solid and deliberate. Their surfaces reflect faint light, their forms steady against the dark water. They seem familiar, and yet they are part of a long story of quiet transformation. You let your thoughts drift backward again, not all the way to the earliest boats, but to a time when change began to move more noticeably through maritime life. Wooden vessels still dominate, sails still guide movement, but something begins to shift. Gradually materials become stronger, designs become more refined. Ships begin to carry more than they once could dot in a sudden leap, but through careful adjustment over time. A widely recognized understanding shows that shipbuilding techniques improve steadily across centuries, influenced by both local knowledge and contact with other regions. Hull shapes became more efficient, sails more adaptable, and construction methods more reliable. These changes did not arrive all at once. They appeared slowly, one improvement at a time. You imagine a shipbuilder standing near the shore examining a newly constructed vessel. Their hands move across the surface, feeling for smoothness, for balance, for signs that the structure will hold against the steady pressure of water. There is no rush in this process. Each detail matters. A lesser-known detail from maritime tradition suggests that shipbuilders often relied on sound as well as sight when assessing their work. Tapping lightly against the wood, they would listen for subtle differences that might reveal weaknesses or inconsistencies. This method required experience. It could not be learned quickly. Some researchers suggest that such practices allowed for a deeper understanding of materials, while others believe they were only part of a broader set of techniques used to ensure durability. The exact methods varied, but the care remained constant. You take a few slow steps along the shoreline, letting your gaze follow another vessel as it moves steadily through the strait. Now you begin to notice the presence of newer elements, metal structures, more defined edges, a sense of weight that feels different from earlier ships. These changes mark another quiet transition, the gradual introduction of steam-powered vessels. Movement no longer depends entirely on wind. A new kind of consistency appears. A broadly accepted historical development shows that the introduction of steam engines allowed ships to maintain more predictable travel patterns, reducing reliance on seasonal winds and enabling more regular passage through important waterways. From where you stand, the difference is not dramatic. The ship still moves slowly, still steadily, but beneath that movement something has changed. You imagine standing on one of these early steam-powered vessels. The sound is different now. A low, steady rhythm replaces the soft pull of sail against wind. The motion feels more controlled, less influenced by shifting conditions. And yet the sea remains the same. It continues to move beneath the vessel, shaping its path in subtle ways. A small but interesting detail appears in some historical accounts describing how sailors transitioning from sail to steam often had to adjust their sense of timing. Journeys that once depended on waiting for the right wind could now proceed more directly, changing how routes were planned. Some researchers suggest this led to a gradual shift in how time was perceived within maritime life, while others believe that older habits of patience remained even as new technologies allowed for the greater control. The transition was not immediate. It unfolded over time. You pause and look out across the strait again. Modern vessels pass through the same space, carrying far more than those earlier ships ever could. Their surfaces are smoother, their shapes more defined, their movement supported by systems that operate quietly in the background. And yet from where you stand, the experience remains familiar. Water moving, ships passing, light reflects softly across the surface. At the end, there are ongoing discussions about how evenly these changes spread across different regions. Some historians suggest that certain areas adopted new technologies more quickly influenced by trade connections and available resources. Others propose that traditional methods persisted for longer periods in some communities, creating a layered transition rather than a uniform one. The evidence reflects both patterns. You let that thought pass gently without needing to settle it. Because here, what matters is not the exact timeline of change, it is the continuity that remains beneath it. Despite new materials, new methods, new systems, the act of moving through this narrow waterway has not disappeared. It has simply adapted, shifted, continued. You take a slow breath and the cool night air settles around you once more. The shoreline feels steady beneath your feet. The water continues its quiet motion, and the ships, whether shaped by wood or steel, whether guided by wind or engine, follow the same path through this narrow passage, one after another, without urgency, without interruption. And as you stand here watching that continuity unfold across time, your thoughts begin to settle once again, carried gently forward, just like the vessels themselves, moving steadily through a space that has held them for centuries. You remain beside the water, and as the image of changing ships settles quietly in your mind, your attention shifts once more, this time toward the feeling of gradual transformation. Not sudden change, not sharp moments of difference, but slow adjustment. You look out across the Strait of Hormuz, and the vessels passing through it seem to carry that idea with them. Each one reflects a different stage, a different moment in time, yet all of them move in the same calm, continuous way. You take a slow step forward, letting the cool sand press gently beneath your feet. The air feels steady, the night unchanged, and yet beneath this stillness there is movement not only across the water but through time itself. You imagine a period when steam and steel began to settle more firmly into maritime life, not replacing everything that came before but gradually blending with it. Sail-powered vessels still exist. They continue to move through the strait guided by wind and experience. But alongside them new ships appear, heavier, more structured. Their presence does not disrupt the rhythm, it simply adds another layer. A widely recognized development shows that during the transition from sail to steam, many regions experienced a long period where both forms of movement coexisted. Older methods remained familiar and reliable, while newer technologies offered different possibilities. This overlap created a kind of balance. Not everything changed at once. You imagine standing on the shore during that time, watching as a sail-driven vessel moves quietly across the water, its movement shaped by wind, while further out a steam-powered ship follows a steady, consistent path. The difference is noticeable, but not overwhelming. Both belong here. A lesser-known detail from this period suggests that some sailors who are accustomed to sail found the transition to steam unfamiliar at first, not because it was more difficult, but because it required a different kind of awareness. Instead of watching the sky for signs of wind, attention shifted toward machinery, fuel, and internal systems. Some researchers suggest that this change altered the relationship between sailor and environment, while others believe that the core connection to the sea remained simply expressed in a new way. The full experience likely varied from one person to another. You continue walking slowly along the shoreline, and the gentle sound of water remains constant beside you. The sea does not react to these changes. It does not distinguish between sail and steam. It continues its quiet motion just as it always has. You notice how the ships, regardless of their design, follow the same narrow path through the strait. The geography does not change. The waterway remains the same. This creates a sense of continuity that holds everything together. Even as technology shifts, the space itself provides stability. You pause again, watching as another vessel passes. Its movement is smooth, predictable, not fast, not slow, just steady. At the same time, there are differing perspectives about how quickly these technological changes influenced everyday maritime life in places like this. Some historians suggest that the adoption of steam power gradually reshaped trade patterns, allowing for more regular and reliable movement. Others propose that in certain regions, traditional methods remain dominant for longer than expected, maintaining older rhythms alongside newer ones. The historical record offers both views. You let that uncertainty remain without needing to settle it, because from where you stand, the experience feels unified. All of these changes spread across time come together in this single moment. Ships moving through the same water, following the same gentle path. You imagine the people who witnessed this transition firsthand. They would not have seen it as a clear divide between past and present. Instead, they would have experienced it as a gradual shift where familiar patterns slowly blended with new ones. A sail replaced here, a new material introduced there. Nothing sudden, nothing overwhelming. Just change unfolding quietly. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how ports and coastal communities adapted to these shifts in subtle ways. Storage areas were adjusted. Docking spaces modified slightly to accommodate different types of vessels. These changes were practical, incremental. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of adaptability within coastal societies, while others suggest it reflects the natural evolution of trade environments responding to new conditions. You take a slow breath and the night air feels steady and cool. The horizon remains calm. The movement of ships continues without interruption. And beneath it all, there is a quiet sense that change does not need to be loud to be meaningful. It can happen slowly, almost unnoticed, carried forward by repetition, by adaptation, by time itself. You look once more across the strait. The vessels continue their passage, different in form, connected in purpose. And as your thoughts follow that gentle continuity, they begin to slow again, not focusing on what has changed, but resting in what remains. The steady movement, the quiet rhythm, the feeling of something ongoing stretching beyond any single moment. You remain beside the shoreline, and after some time, your attention begins to settle into something quieter still. Not the ships, not the past, but the feeling of presence along the coast itself. You look toward the land that stretches gently beside you, and there is a subtle sense that this place is being watched, not in a tense or intrusive way, but in a calm and continuous manner. A kind of quiet awareness. You take a few slow steps, and the ground beneath your feet feels steady, familiar. The air moves lightly, carrying both the coolness of the sea and the stillness of the land. Somewhere along this coastline, beyond what you can clearly see in the darkness, there are places where people observe the movement of vessels as they pass. Not to interrupt, not to control, but simply to remain aware. Over time, as the flow of ships through this narrow passage increased, systems of observation gradually developed. These systems did not always take the form of large structures or visible markers. Often they were simple arrangements, positions along the shore where individuals could watch, listen, and respond if needed. It was a quiet form of presence. You imagine one of these places now, a small structure set slightly above the waterline, positioned where the view extends clearly across the strait. The light inside is soft, not bright enough to disturb the night, just enough to allow someone to see what is in front of them. Inside, a person sits or stands, their attention moving between the horizon and whatever simple tools they have nearby. There is no rush in their movement, only consistency. A well-supported historical understanding shows that coastal monitoring in important waterways developed gradually as maritime traffic increased. These practices helped maintain safe passage by allowing those on land to remain aware of conditions and movement. They were not always centralized. They were often distributed. You pause and let that idea settle. Observation, not intervention. Presence, not pressure. You look out across the water again, and the ships continue to move as they always have. Steady, unbroken. They do not appear to react to anything on the shore, and yet there is a quiet connection between land and sea that becomes easier to sense. A lesser-known detail from some historical accounts suggests that early observers along coastlines sometimes relied on sound as much as sight. The distant echo of a vessel moving through the water, the subtle change in the rhythm of waves, these could offer clues about what was happening beyond clear visibility. This kind of listening required patience, attention. Some researchers propose that such sensory awareness formed an important part of early monitoring practices, while others believe its role was limited compared to visual observation, especially as technology advanced. The exact balance remains open to interpretation. You continue walking and the shoreline feels calm beneath your feet. The night holds everything in a soft, steady stillness. And yet within that stillness there is awareness. You imagine how these systems evolved over time, from simple observation points to more structured arrangements, from individual watchers to coordinated efforts that allowed information to move along the coast as smoothly as the ships moved across the water. Not fast, not urgent, just continuous. You notice how this quiet presence does not disrupt the natural rhythm of the place. It fits within it, like another layer. The sea continues to move, the ships continue to pass, and the shoreline continues to observe. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how formal these systems became in various periods. Some historians suggest that in certain regions, coastal observation developed into more organized structures with defined roles. Others propose that in many areas the process remained informal for longer, shaped by the local needs and available resources. The evidence reflects both patterns. You let that thought pass gently. It does not need to settle into a single answer. Because here what matters is not the exact form of these systems, it is the feeling they create. A sense that this place is not left unattended, that someone somewhere along this quiet coastline is always watching in a calm and steady way. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how observers would sometimes mark the passing of vessels in simple ways, noting their direction or approximate time, not for strict record-keeping, but to maintain a sense of flow. These markings were not always preserved. They were part of a continuous process. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of tracking movement, while others suggest it was simply a habit that helped structure long periods of observation. You take a slow breath and the air feels still and balanced. The horizon remains calm, the ships continue this passage, and the shoreline quiet and steady remains present beside them. You stand there for a moment longer, letting the idea of quiet observation settle into your thoughts. Not something that demands attention, not something that interrupts, just something that exists gently. Cheers. Continuously, and as you remain in that feeling, your thoughts begin to slow once again, following the same steady pattern. Aware but unhurried, present but at ease. You remain by the shoreline, and after some time, the quiet presence of observation fades gently into the background. What stays with you now is something simpler, the rhythm. You look out across the strait again, and the movement of ships no longer feels like separate events. Instead, it begins to feel like a continuous flow, one that does not start or stop, but simply carries on. A vessel passes, then another follows. Not immediately, not delayed, just spaced in a way that feels natural. You do not need to count them. You begin to feel them, like waves. You take a slow step forward, letting your feet settle into the sand, and as you stand still again, the pattern becomes clearer. Each ship moves with quiet consistency. No sudden changes, no sharp turns, just a steady forward motion that blends into the larger movement around it. Over time, this steady passage has come to define the character of this narrow waterway. It is not a place of stillness, but neither is it a place of rush. It exists somewhere in between, shaped by constant measured movement. You imagine this rhythm extending beyond the moment you're in now. Day after day, night after night, season after season, the ships continue, their presence forming a kind of quiet pulse that never fully stops. A broadly accepted understanding shows that major trade routes passing through this region have long been defined by continuity rather than interruption. Goods move steadily supported by systems that aim to maintain flow rather than accelerate it beyond control. From where you stand, that idea feels tangible. You can see it. You can feel it. You notice how your own breathing begins to match this rhythm. Slow, even, unforced. A lesser-known detail appears in some maritime observations where sailors, after long periods at sea, begin to perceive movement not as separate moments, but as a continuous experience. time feels less divided, more fluid, shaped by the steady motion of the vessel. Some researchers suggest that this shift in perception reflects a deeper adaptation to repetitive environments, while others believe it is simply a natural response to extended periods of calm activity. Either way, it mirrors what you are beginning to feel now. You remain still watching as another ship moves quietly across the water. It does not draw your attention in the way it might have earlier. It simply becomes part of the whole. The light it carries blends with the others. Its motion aligns with the pattern. Nothing stands out, and that is what makes it calming. You take a slow breath and the air feels smooth as it moves through you. The night remains steady. The sound of the water continues without change, and the ships keep moving. You imagine how this rhythm has persisted across centuries. Different vessels, different people, different purposes. And yet the pattern remains. Movement without urgency, presence without interruption. At the same time, there are differing views about how consistent this rhythm has been across history. Some historians suggest that periods of increased activity may have introduced moments of density where the flow felt more concentrated. Others propose that even during busier times, the overall sense of continuity remained shaped by the natural constraints of the waterway. The historical picture allows for both interpretations. You let that thought settle without needing to resolve it, because what matters here is not the variation. It is the underlying pattern. You notice how the sea itself reflects this rhythm. The waves do not rush. They repeat, each one following the last, not identical but familiar. You begin to feel that everything here follows the same principle. Water, ships, air, even your thoughts. Chokepoints. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how experienced navigators could sense when the rhythm of movement around them changed even slightly. A shift in spacing, a difference in timing, something subtle that signaled adjustment. This awareness did not rely on measurement. It relied on feeling. Some researchers interpret this as a refined sensitivity developed through long exposure, while others believe it may be more intuitive than precise. You take another slow breath, letting that idea pass gently. The horizon remains calm. The lights remain steady. The movement continues, and as you stand here, no longer trying to follow each individual ship, but instead resting within the flow itself, your thoughts begin to settle even more deeply. There is nothing to track, nothing to anticipate, just the quiet repetition of movement across water, a rhythm that has carried on for so long that it no longer needs to be noticed to exist. And in that realization, everything feels softer, simpler, held within a pattern that does not need to change. You remain by the shoreline, and as the steady rhythm of passing ships settles deeper into your awareness, your attention begins to shift towards something less visible. The systems beneath the surface of what you see, not the water itself this time, but the quiet coordination that allows everything to move so smoothly. You look out across the strait again, and at first nothing appears different. These ships continue their passage in that same calm, measured way. The spacing remains consistent, the motion unbroken. But now you begin to sense that this simplicity rests on something more layered, something unseen. You take a slow step forward, letting your eyes follow a vessel as it glides through the narrow waterway. It holds its path, steadily adjusting only slightly as it continues forward. There is no visible guidance, no obvious direction being given, and yet the movement remains organized. This is where modern systems begin to quietly reveal themselves. Over time, as maritime activity increased and vessels became larger and more numerous, methods of coordination evolved to support safe and continuous passage. These systems include communication between ships, shared awareness of position, and guidelines that help maintain spacing and direction. They are not loud, they are not intrusive, they exist quietly in the background. You imagine this coordination not as something mechanical or rigid, but as a kind of shared understanding that flows alongside the ships themselves. Signals pass between vessels, positions are noted, adjustments are made in small, careful ways. A broadly accepted understanding shows that in important waterways, communication systems allow ships to remain aware of one another even when they are not directly visible. This helps maintain the steady rhythm you see from the shore. From where you stand, none of this is obvious. The surface remains calm, the movement unchanged, But beneath it there is a quiet exchange of information that keeps everything aligned. You pause and listen. The sounds do not reveal these systems. The water continues its soft rhythm. The wind moves gently across the surface. The ships pass without drawing attention, and yet something connects them. A lesser-known detail from maritime practice suggests that even with advanced communication systems, much of the coordination between ships still relies on small adjustments rather than large changes. A slight shift in speed, a gentle alteration in direction. These movements are often so subtle that they are not noticed by an observer on the shore. Some researchers suggest that this reflects a preference for maintaining stability within the flow, while others believe it is simply the most efficient way to manage shared space. The exact reasoning may vary, but the effect is clear. Everything continues smoothly. You begin to imagine how this invisible coordination has developed over time, from simple observation to shared habits, to more structured communication, each layer building upon the last, not replacing what came before but refining it. You take a few steps along the shoreline and the sand shifts softly beneath your feet. The night remains calm, the horizon steady, and the ships continue their passage guided by systems you cannot see but can sense. At the same time, there are ongoing discussions about how these systems have changed in response to increasing global movement. Some historians and researchers suggest that modern coordination relies heavily on technology creating a more predictable flow. Others propose that human judgment remains just as important, with individuals making decisions based on experience and awareness. The balance between these elements continues to evolve. You let that thought pass gently, because here in this moment the complexity does not feel overwhelming. It feels softened, integrated into the rhythm of each place. You notice how your own thoughts begin to follow that same pattern, not focusing on details, not trying to understand every layer, just sensing that there is more beneath the surface, and allowing that to be enough. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors sometimes refer to this kind of coordination as a shared awareness of space rather than a set of instructions. They move not because they are told exactly what to do, but because they understand how to move within the flow around them. Some researchers interpret this as a continuation of older maritime traditions adapted to modern systems, while others believe it represents a distinct shift in how navigation is approached. You take a slow breath and the cool night air settles gently around you. The water continues its quiet motion. The ships pass one after another, and the invisible systems that guide them remain unseen yet present, holding everything together, without drawing attention, without disturbing the calm. And as you stand here, letting that quiet coordination settle into your awareness, your thoughts begin to slow once more, carried not by what you can see but by what you can sense. A gentle understanding, a quiet connection, moving steadily just beneath the surface. You remain beside this water, and after some time the idea of unseen systems softens into the background like a thought that no longer needs to be held. What comes forward instead is something more human, the quiet exchange of voices, not loud, not urgent, just present. You look out across the strait again, and while the ships continue their steady movement, you begin to imagine the conversations that travel with them. Not the goods, not the structures, but the simple act of communication. You take a slow step along the shoreline and the night air carries a faint suggestion of sound. Not distinct, not clear enough to understand, but enough to remind you that even in this calm environment, voices move across distance in subtle ways. Long ago, communication between vessels and shore was limited. Visual signals, gestures, simple sounds. These methods worked, but only within certain conditions. Over time, this began to change. A broadly accepted development shows that as maritime activity expanded, new forms of communication emerged, allowing ships to share information across greater distances. Signals became more refined, and eventually technologies allowed voices themselves to travel across the water. From where you stand, that transition feels distant, but it is present in the quiet hum that occasionally reaches you from the ships. You imagine an earlier moment when communication relied on light and movement. A lantern raised slightly higher, a flag shifted into a different position, a gesture repeated in a specific way. Each of these carried a meaning understood by those who knew how to read them. A lesser-known detail from maritime traditions suggests that some sailors developed personal variations of common, signals, small adjustments that reflected their own habits or preferences. These variations did not always cause confusion. Instead, they added a layer of familiarity for those who worked together regularly. Some researchers suggest that this personalization of communication helped strengthen trust among crews, while others believe it may have introduced subtle challenges when unfamiliar vessels encountered one another. The balance between clarity and individuality remains an open question. You pause and listen again. Now you imagine the shift toward more direct communication. Voices carried not by proximity but by invisible waves moving through the air. Short exchanges, clear, measured. Information shared with ear-raising volume. You imagine a voice speaking across the water, calm and steady, noting position, direction, or simple acknowledgement. There is no urgency in the tone. Just clarity, just presence. The response comes in the same way. Quiet, controlled. A brief connection formed, then released. You take a slow breath, letting that imagined exchange settle. It feels different from earlier forms of communication, but it carries the same intention. To maintain awareness, to support movement, to keep the rhythm steady. You notice how this evolution does not disrupt the calm of the place. It fits within it, like another layer that rests gently beneath the surface. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how these communication methods change the experience of maritime travel. Some historians suggest that increased clarity allowed for greater confidence and coordination, reducing uncertainty. Others propose that it may have shifted the nature of navigation, placing more focus on information and less on direct observation. The historical understanding remains open to interpretation. You let that thought pass without needing to hold on to it, because here what matters is not the exact nature of these systems. It is the feeling they create, a sense of quiet connection, even across distance. You look out once more across the strait. The ships continue their passage, their light steady, their movement unchanged. And somewhere within that movement, voices travel, softly, briefly, connecting one point to another without drawing attention to themselves. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors often develop a particular tone when speaking over distance, not loud, not sharp, but measured in a way that carries clearly without breaking the calm. Some researchers interpret this as a practical adaptation to the environment, while others suggest it reflects the culture of maritime life itself, where clarity and calmness are closely linked. You take another slow breath and the cool air settles around you once more. The night remains steady. The water continues its quiet motion, and the unseen exchange of voices blends into the rhythm of the place. Not standing apart, not interrupting, just existing. And as you stand here listening, not for specific words, but for the feeling of connection that moves gently across the water, your thoughts begin to slow again, carried by something soft, something continuous, a quiet conversation that never fully stops. You remain by the shoreline, and after a while, the quiet sense of connection carried by distant voices begins to soften. What draws your attention now is the land again, not the small harbours you passed before. Something larger, something that has grown slowly over time. You take a few steps inland, and the ground beneath your feet begins to feel more defined. The path becomes clearer, shaped by repeated movement, by the steady passage of people and goods over many years. Ahead you begin to sense the presence of a larger harbour, not a meter missandi. Visible, but felt. There is a subtle shift in the air, a faint suggestion of activity, not loud, not overwhelming, just more concentrated. You continue forward and gradually the space opens. The shoreline here is broader, shaped to receive more than a few small vessels. The water remains calmer, but there is a sense that it has been gently guided, shaped in ways that allow for smoother arrival and departure. These are not sudden constructions. They have formed over time. Carefully! A widely accepted understanding shows that as maritime trade expanded, certain coastal locations developed into larger ports where goods could be handled more efficiently. These places did not appear overnight. They grew gradually, responding to the needs of increasing movement. You imagine this harbour in its earlier stages. At first, it is simply an extension of the smaller spaces you've seen before. a place where more boats gather, where the ground is worn more deeply, where the rhythm of activity becomes slightly more layered. Then over time adjustments are made. Edges are reinforced, paths are widened, storage areas become more organised. Not through a single plan, but through repeated use. You notice how everything still feels calm, even as the scale increases. There is no sense of crowding, no urgency. Just a steady presence of activity that blends into the environment. A lesser-known detail from historical observations suggests that early ports often developed specialised areas within them not formally marked but understood through use. Certain sections became associated with specific types of goods or activities, creating a quiet order within the larger space. Some researchers suggest that this informal organisation allowed for flexibility, while others believe it gradually led to more structured systems as trade continued to grow. The exact progression is not always clear. You walk slowly along the edge of this larger harbour, and the ground beneath your feet feels firmer shaped by the continuous movement. Small traces of use are everywhere. Marks in the earth, subtle impressions where objects have rested, paths that have formed naturally between areas. You imagine the people who move through this space. They are not rushing, but there are more of them. Their actions remain steady, but now there is a greater sense of coordination. One person carries goods toward a storage area. Another prepares a vessel for departure. A third checks items that have recently arrived. Each task fits into the whole. You pause and look out toward the water. Here the ships appear slightly closer, more defined. They approach with care, guided gently into position. There is a quiet awareness in their movement, a sense that this space is shared and understood. At the same time, there are differing interpretations about how quickly these larger ports became organised in more formal ways. Some historians suggest that administrative systems eventually developed to manage increasing complexity, introducing clearer roles and responsibilities. Others propose that for long periods these spaces remained largely self-regulated, with order emerging from repeated interaction rather than strict oversight. The historical record allows for both views. You let that thought settle without needing to resolve it, because from where you stand the experience feels unified, whether guided formally or informally. Formally, the movement remains smooth, continuous. You notice how the air carries a slightly different scent here, still touched by salt, but now mixed with this presence of materials, goods, and human activity. It is not overwhelming. Just noticeable, a sign that this place holds more than passing movement. It holds exchange. You imagine the slow expansion of this harbour across generations, not driven by urgency, but by necessity. As more ships arrive, more space is needed. As more goods pass through, more organisation emerges. Each change builds upon the last. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how early ports sometimes developed areas of rest where travellers could pause before continuing their journeys. These spaces were not always formal structures, but they provided a moment of stillness within the larger flow. Some researchers interpret this as an early recognition of the need for balance between movement and rest, while others see it simply as a practical adaptation to long journeys. You take a slow breath, letting the air settle gently around you. The harbour feels calm, the movement steady, and the larger scale of this place does not disturb the quiet rhythm you've been following. It expands it. You look once more across the water where ships continue their passage, now entering and leaving this space with the same measured motion. Nothing abrupt, nothing forced, just a steady continuation. And as you stand within this slightly wider, slightly more active environment, your thoughts begin to settle once more, not focused on the details, not tracking each movement, just resting within the flow. A quiet expansion of the same rhythm you've been following all along. You remain near the larger harbour, and after a while the quiet sense of expanded activity begins to settle into something even softer, not the movement itself, but what moves within it. You turn your attention back toward the ships, and as you watch them pass you begin to think, not about their shape or their path, but about what they carry, not visible from here. Not something you can see, but something that flows steadily through this narrow passage day after day. You take a slow breath and the air feels still, as if holding that thought gently in place. For a long time, this waterway has been part of a broader system of exchange, where resources travel from one region to another, linking distant places in quiet and continuous ways. Among these movements, one type of cargo has become especially significant over time. Energy, not in the form of light or motion that you can observe directly, but in materials carried within the ships themselves. A widely recognized understanding shows that in more recent centuries, this region has become an important pathway for the transport of energy resources, particularly oil, which moves steadily through these waters to reach different parts of the world. From where you stand, none of that is visible. The ships look the same, their movement unchanged, but within them there is something that connects far beyond this quiet shoreline. You imagine one of these vessels more closely. Its structure is larger, its form designed to hold what cannot be seen from the outside. It moves slowly, carefully guided by systems that ensure stability and balance. There is no outward sign of what it carries, only presence. A lesser-known detail from maritime operations suggests that ships carrying such resources are often managed with particular attention to stability, adjusting internal balance to respond to movement across the water. This process is continuous, not dramatic, ensuring that the vessel remains steady as it travels. Some researchers suggest that these adjustments reflect a deep understanding of both material and environment, while others see them as part of standardized procedures developed over time. Either way, they remain mostly unseen. You continue watching the ships, and now they begin to feel slightly different. Not in appearance, but in meaning. Each one becomes a quiet link in a larger chain, a connection between places you cannot see from here, between systems that operate far beyond this calm moment. And yet none of that disrupts the rhythm. The ship still moves slowly, still evenly, still part of the same steady flow. You take a few steps along the shoreline, letting the sand shift gently beneath your feet. The night remains calm, the air soft, and the presence of this larger movement does not feel heavy. It feels integrated, part of the same pattern you have been following all along. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how this flow has changed over time. Some historians and researchers suggest that the increasing movement of energy resources has shaped the importance of this passage in new ways, connecting it more closely to global systems. Others propose that while the scale has changed, the underlying rhythm of movement remains consistent with earlier periods of trade. The understanding continues to evolve. You let that thought settle without needing to follow it further, because here what matters is not the sail, it is the continuity, the sense that something is always moving through this space, carried quietly, without interruption. You notice how the sea itself does not change in response to what is carried. It remains the same. The waves move, the surface shifts, the rhythm continues, and the ships, regardless of what they hold, follow the same path. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how crews aboard these vessels often experience long periods where nothing outwardly changes. The journey continues, the environment remains steady, and time feels stretched into a continuous flow. Some researchers interpret this as a reflection of how modern maritime travel still carries elements of earlier experiences despite technological changes. Others believe that the scale of modern systems introduces a different kind of awareness, one that connects individual journeys to larger networks. You take a slow breath and the cool night air settles gently around you. The harbour remains behind you, the open water stretches ahead, and the ships continue their passage, carrying with them things that are both simple and complex at the same time. From the outside, they are just shapes moving across water. From within, they hold connections that extend far beyond this place. And yet from where you stand, none of that complexity needs to be held. It can remain soft, distant, part of the background. What remains close is the rhythm, the steady movement, the quiet presence of ships passing through a narrow space that has carried so much for so long. And as your thoughts follow that gentle continuity, they begin to slow once more, resting within the same calm flow. Unbroken, unhurried, simply continuing. You remain near the shoreline, and as the quiet idea of what moves within the ships settles gently into the background, your attention begins to return to something simpler again. The people who remain awake while others rest. The ones who watch through the night. You turn slightly, letting your gaze drift along the coastline where faint points of light appear at intervals, not bright, not distracting, just present enough to suggest that someone is there. Keeping watch, not with urgency, but with consistency. You take a slow step forward and the ground beneath your feet feels cool and steady. The night air has deepened, carrying a softness that seems to quiet everything around you. Somewhere along this coast there are individuals who remain awake during these hours, observing the steady passage of ships, listening to the rhythm of the water, maintaining awareness in a way that feels almost meditative. A broadly accepted understanding shows that in maritime environments, night watches have long been an essential part of maintaining continuity. Whether on land or at sea, these periods of quiet observation ensure that movement continues smoothly even while most of the world sleeps. But here it does not feel like a task. It feels like a presence. You imagine one of these night watchers. They stand or sit in a place where the view extends across the strait. The light around them is minimal, just enough to see without disrupting the darkness. Their posture is relaxed, their attention steady but not strained. They are not searching for something. They are simply aware. A lesser-known detail from maritime tradition suggests that night watches often develop their own quiet routines to pass time without losing focus. Small actions repeated gently, adjusting position, noting movement, listening carefully to subtle changes in sound. These routines were not distractions. They were part of the rhythm. Some researchers suggest that such habits helped maintain alertness without creating tension, while others believe they reflect the natural human tendency to create structure within long periods of stillness. The exact purpose may vary, but the effect is clear. The watch remains calm. You pause and listen. The sounds of the night feel softer now. The water moves with the same steady rhythm. The wind brushes lightly across the surface, and somewhere in the distance a faint sound carries across the water, too quiet to identify clearly, but enough to remind you that movement continues. You imagine the experience of staying awake through the night in a place like this. Time does not pass in the usual way. There are no clear divisions, no strong markers, just a gradual shift from one moment to the next. The sky changes slowly. The air cools slightly. The rhythm remains constant. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how experienced night watchers become attuned to very subtle changes in their environment. A slight difference in the sound of water. A faint shift in the pattern of lights, something that might go unnoticed by others. This awareness develops over time. It is not taught directly. It emerges through repetition. Some researchers interpret this as a heightened sensitivity shaped by quiet environments, while others suggest it is simply a result of sustained attention over long periods. You take a slow breath, letting the cool air settle gently around you. The shoreline feels still. The lights remain faint, and the ships continue their passage steady and unbroken. At the same time, there are differing perspectives about how these night watches have changed over time. Some historians suggest that technological advancements have altered the nature of observation, introducing new tools and systems. Others propose that despite these changes, the fundamental experience of keeping watch remains similar, shaped by the same quiet environment and steady rhythm. The understanding continues to unfold. You let that thought pass without holding on to it. Because here in this moment what matters is the feeling, the calm presence of someone awake while the world rests, the steady awareness that nothing needs to be rushed, that everything continues. You look out across the strait once more. The ships move as they always have. The lights remain steady. The rhythm does not change. And along the shore, unseen but present, the night watch continues, not interrupting, not controlling, just observing. You remain still for a moment longer, letting that quiet presence settle into your thoughts. There is something comforting in it, a sense that even in the deepest part of the night there is continuity, awareness, gentle attention. And as you stand there listening to the soft movement of water and feeling the stillness of the land beside you, your thoughts begin to slow once again, resting within that same quiet watch, calm, steady, unbroken. You remain by the shoreline, and after a while the quiet presence of those who keep watch fades gently into the background. What comes forward now is something even softer. The influence of the environment itself. You lift your gaze slightly and the sky feels heavier than before, not in a troubling way, but in a way that suggests change. The air carries a faint difference. Cooler, more still. You take a slow breath and there is a subtle sense that the night is shifting. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticed if you are paying attention. Out across the strait, the ships continue their steady passage, but their outlines appear slightly less defined now, softened by the atmosphere that settles gently over the water. You watch carefully and you begin to notice how the horizon seems less clear. The line between sea and sky blurs. A thin layer of mist begins to form, almost invisible at first, then gradually more present. This is not unusual here. A commonly understood pattern shows that coastal regions like this can experience subtle weather changes during the night, where shifts in temperature allow moisture to gather and form light fog over the water. It does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly. You imagine sailors encountering the same condition long ago. The shoreline, once clear, becomes softer. Landmarks fade. Marks fade. The water feels more enclosed even though it remains just as wide. Movement continues, but with greater attention. A lesser-known detail from maritime experience suggests that in light fog, sailors often relied more heavily on sound than sight, listening for echoes, for the movement of water, for any indication of nearby presence. This shift in awareness was not dramatic, it was gradual. Some researchers suggest that this adaptation reflects the flexibility of maritime knowledge, while others believe it simply highlights the importance of multiple senses in navigation. The exact interpretation may vary, but the experience remains consistent. You take a few slow steps closer to the water and the air feels slightly damp, now brushing softly against your skin. The scent of salt is still there, but it is muted, blended into the moisture that hangs lightly in the air. The sounds change as well. They feel closer, more contained. The gentle movement of waves becomes more noticeable, as if the mist holds the sound in place. You look out again and the ships are still visible, but their lights appear softer, diffused through the thin layer of fog. Each point of light spreads slightly, creating a gentle glow rather than a sharp reflection. It feels calm, quiet. You imagine how this condition might influence the steady rhythm you've been observing. The ships do not stop. They do not rush. They continue, but with a slightly heightened sense of awareness, maintaining their paths with the same quiet consistency. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how much these subtle weather changes affected maritime movement in earlier periods. Some historians suggest that light fog would have slowed navigation slightly, encouraging greater caution. Others propose that experienced sailors adapted easily, maintaining steady movement even in reduced visibility. The historical understanding allows for both possibilities. You let that thought settle without needing to resolve it, because here what matters is not the difficulty. It is the atmosphere, the way the environment shapes the experience of this place. You notice how the shoreline itself becomes softer, edges less defined, details less sharp. Everything feels gently blurred, not in a way that obscures, but in a way that simplifies. You take a slow breath and the air feels cool and smooth as it moves through you. The mist continues to rest lightly over the water. The ships continue their passage, and the rhythm remains unchanged. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors would sometimes pause briefly in such conditions, not to stop completely, but to align themselves more carefully with their surroundings, allowing the environment to guide their movement as much as their own intention. Some researchers interpret this as a form of environmental awareness, while others see it as a practical adjustment to maintain safety. You stand still, letting the quiet presence of the mist settle around you. The world feels smaller now, more contained, but not restricted, just softened. And as you remain here, watching the gentle glow of distant lights through the thin veil of fog, your thoughts begin to slow once more. Not following clear lines, not holding sharp edges, just drifting, like the mist itself, settling gently over everything. You remain by the shoreline, and as the light mist settles gently over the water, your awareness begins to widen again. Not outward in distance, but outward in meaning. The ships continue their passage through the softened horizon. their lights diffused into quiet halos that drift steadily from one side of the strait to the other. They no longer feel like individual movements. They feel like connections. You take a slow breath and the air feels cool and smooth, carrying a stillness that seems to hold everything together. This narrow stretch of water may appear small from where you stand, but it links places that extend far beyond what you can see tonight. To one side, coastlines shaped by long histories of settlement and trade. To the other, open waters that lead toward distant regions where these ships will eventually arrive. You do not see those places, but you feel their presence. A commonly recognized historical perspective suggests that waterways like this one have long served as quiet connectors between distant societies, allowing goods, ideas, and habits to move gradually across regions. Not quickly, eh? Not dramatically, but steadily. You imagine one of these ships continuing its journey beyond the strait. It leaves this narrow passage behind, entering wider waters where the horizon stretches further and the sense of distance grows. Days pass, then more days. The environment changes slightly. The air feels different. The light shifts, and eventually land appears again. A different shoreline, a different place, and yet connected to this one. You pause and let that idea settle. Connection across distance. Movement that begins here but does not end here. A lesser known detail from some maritime observations suggests that sailors often experience these transitions between regions as gradual rather than distinct. The sea does not change suddenly. It shifts slowly, carrying subtle differences in colour, temperature, and movement. These changes are not always obvious. They are felt over time. Some researchers suggest that this gradual transition helps create a sense of continuity across long journeys, while others believe it highlights how interconnected different parts of the sea truly are. You look out again across the strait. The ships continue their passage, but now they seem to carry more than just goods. They carry distance itself, each one bridging spaces that remain unseen. You take a few slow steps along the shoreline and the sand feels cool beneath your feet, shaped by the same steady rhythm you've been following all along. The mist lingers, softening the edges of everything. The lights remain steady, and the movement continues. At the same time, there are different interpretations about how deeply these connections influence the regions they linked. Some historians suggest that repeated exchange through waterways like this one gradually shaped cultural habits, introducing small changes over time. Others propose that while goods moved easily deeper, cultural shifts were more limited, with local traditions remaining strong. The evidence offers both possibilities. You let that thought rest without needing to follow it further, because here what matters is not the outcome. It is the process, the quiet act of connection. You notice how the sea itself reflects this idea. It does not belong to one place. It touches many. It carries movement without a holding gear to it. And the ships moving through it follow that same pattern. They arrive. They pass. They continue. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how certain routes across the sea became familiar, not because they were marked, but because they were repeated so often that they existed in memory. Sailors would follow these paths not by seeing them, but by knowing them. Some researchers interpret this as an early form of mental mapping, while others suggest it reflects the deep relationship between movement and memory in maritime life. You take a slow breath and the cooler air settles gently around you. The shoreline feels quiet, the mist remains soft, and the ships continue their steady movement through this narrow space that connects so much more than it reveals. You stand still for a moment, letting that sense of connection settle into your thoughts. Not something you need to understand fully, just something you can feel. A quiet link between distant places, carried gently through water that never stops moving. And as your thoughts follow that gentle expansion, they begin to slow once more, not focusing on distance, not tracing each path, just resting within the idea that everything is connected, softly, continuously, without effort. You remain by the shoreline, and as the quiet sense of distant connection settles into the background, your attention gently returns to something closer again. The people who live here, not those who pass through, but those who stay. You take a slow step along the edge of the water, and the ground beneath your feet feels familiar. now shaped by repetition, by the quiet presence of lives lived beside this constant movement. The mist has begun to thin slightly, and the outlines of the shoreline become a little clearer again. Shapes emerge where before there was only softness. Simple structures, faint paths, small signs of daily life. You walk a little further and the sense of stillness deepens, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening in a quiet, predictable way. Life here does not rush to meet the movement of ships. It exists alongside it. A commonly accepted understanding suggests that coastal communities near important waterways often develop rhythms that align with but do not depend entirely on passing trade. Fishing, household work, and local exchange continue steadily even as larger systems move just beyond reach. You imagine a household near the shoreline. The light inside is soft, barely visible from where you stand. Someone moves quietly within completing a task that has likely been done many times before. There is no urgency, no need to hurry. Outside, the sea continues its steady motion, but it does not interrupt what is happening here. It simply accompanies it. A lesser-known detail from some coastal traditions suggests that many daily routines were shaped not only by the time of day, but by the sound of the sea itself. The rhythm of waves could influence when certain tasks began or ended, creating a subtle connection between environment and activity. Some researchers suggest that this reflects a deep integration between people and place, while others believe it may be more symbolic than practical. The exact influence is not always clear. You continue walking and the shoreline feels quieter still. The ships are still there, but they are no longer the focus. They move in the distance, part of the background. What feels closer now is the steadiness of life on land. You notice how objects are placed with intention. A tool left where it will be needed again. A piece of fabric folded carefully. A path worn into the ground by repeated use. These small details carry a sense of continuity. Nothing is temporary. Everything returns. You pause and listen. The sounds are soft. Water, wind, a faint movement from within one of the nearby structures. It all blends together. There is no sharp distinction between activity and rest. They flow into one another. At the same time, there are different views about how much these communities changed as the importance of nearby waterways increased. Some historians suggest that growing trade gradually influenced daily life, introducing new goods and practices over time. Others propose that many communities maintained their existing rhythms, adapting only in small ways, while preserving a strong sense of continuity. The historical picture remains open. You let that thought pass without holding on to it, because here what matters is not the scale of change. It is the feeling of stability. You imagine someone stepping outside into the night, standing near the edge of the water just as you are now. They do not watch every ship. They do not track every movement. They simply stand, feeling the air, listening to the water, aware of the presence of something larger but not overwhelmed by it. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how people living near such waterways often develop a quiet familiarity with passing vessels, recognizing patterns of movement without needing to observe them directly. Some researchers interpret this as a form of environmental awareness shaped by long exposure, while others believe it reflects the human tendency to find rhythm in repeated patterns. You take a slow breath and the air feels calm and balanced. The mist continues to lift. The shoreline becomes clearer, and the steady movement of ships remains in the distance unchanged. You stand there for a moment longer, letting the quiet presence of life on land settle into your thoughts. Not separate from the sea, not defined by it, just existing beside it. Steady, continuous, unhurried. And as your thoughts follow that same quiet rhythm, they begin to slow once more, resting in the familiarity of this place, where movement and stillness exist together. Without conflict, without urgency, just gently continuing. You remain by the shoreline, and after a while the quiet presence of daily life fades gently into the background. What stays with you now is something broader, the feeling of time itself. You stand still looking out across the strait, and it becomes harder to separate the present moment from everything that has come before it. The ships moving through the water feel both current and familiar, as if they belong to many different moments at once. You take a slow breath and the air feels steady, unchanged. The water moves just as it did earlier, just as it did centuries ago. just as it will continue to do. A widely recognized understanding shows that certain geographical features, especially narrow waterways like this one, maintain their importance across long stretches of history, even as the societies around them change. Empires rise, communities shift, technologies evolve, but the passage remains. You imagine standing here in a different time. The ships look different, the people speak different languages, the goods being carried have changed, and yet the movement feels the same, steady, continuous, unbroken. You take a few slow steps along the shoreline, and the ground beneath your feet feels familiar, as if it has held the weight of countless others before you. Each step leaves a mark, temporary, soon erased by the gentle movement of sand and water, and yet over time these small moments gather into something larger, a pattern, a presence. A lesser-known detail from historical observations suggests that certain coastal paths used for generations can subtly shape the land itself, creating faint but lasting impressions that guide movement even without clear markers. Some researchers suggest that this reflects the quiet accumulation of repeated action, while others believe it may simply be a natural interaction between human movement and the environment. The exact explanation remains open. You pause and look out across the water again. The ships continue their passage just as they have in every moment you have imagined. Different forms, different purposes, but the same path. There is something calming in that continuity, a sense that not everything changes, that some things remain steady, holding everything else together. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how much this continuity shapes the way history is understood. Some historians suggest that stable features like this waterway act as anchors, providing a consistent framework through which change can be observed. Others propose that focusing too much on continuity can soften the impact of transformation, making change appear less significant than it truly is. Both ideas carry weight. You let them pass without needing to choose between them. Because here what matters is the feeling, the sense of standing within a moment that is part of something much larger. You notice how the sea does not hold on to the past. It moves, always forward, and yet it carries echoes of everything that has come before, in its rhythm, in its motion, in its quiet presence. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how sailors often speak of certain places as feeling familiar even on first arrival. Not because they have been there before, but because the patterns of movement feel known. Some researchers interpret this as a reflection of shared maritime experiences across regions, while others suggest it may be more psychological, shaped by expectation and perception. You take a slow breath and the air feels cool and steady as it moves through you. The night remains calm, the shoreline quiet, and the ships continue their passage, linking past and present in a way that feels seamless. You stand there for a moment longer, letting that continuity settle into your thoughts. Not something you need to define, just something you can feel. A steady line stretching through time, carried by water that does not stop, guided by patterns that do not break. And as your thoughts follow that line, they begin to slow once more. Not moving backward, not moving forward, just resting, within the quiet presence of something that continues no matter how much else changes around it. You remain by the shoreline, and after some time the quiet weight of passing centuries begins to soften. The night does not end suddenly, it shifts. You lift your gaze slightly and the sky feels different now. Not brighter in a clear way, but lighter, as if the darkness itself is beginning to loosen. The mist has nearly faded. The horizon, once softened and blurred, becomes more defined again. You take a slow breath and the air feels a little less cool, carrying the faintest hint of warmth that signals what is coming. Morning is approaching, not quickly. Queerly, gently. You look out across the strait and the ships continue their passage just as they did in the night. Their lights are still visible, but they feel less dominant now, less necessary as the first traces of natural light begin to return. The water reflects this change. The dark surface begins to lighten not all at once, but in small, gradual shifts. You watch as the line between sea and sky becomes clearer, more certain. A widely accepted observation shows that the coastal environments often experience a slow transition between night and day, where light emerges, gradually allowing both land and sea to adjust without sudden contrast. Here that transition feels especially calm. Nothing changes abruptly. Everything unfolds. You imagine this same moment in earlier times, a sailor standing on a deck, noticing the sky begin to lighten. A figure on the shore, pausing, sensing the shift without needing to look directly at it. Morning does not arrive with noise. It arrives with presence. You take a few slow steps along the shoreline and the sand beneath your feet feels slightly warmer than before, even though the sun has not yet fully risen. The air moves gently, carrying a different texture now. Less still, more open. A lesser known detail from some coastal traditions suggests that early morning was often a preferred time for certain activities, not only because of cooler temperatures, but because the calm conditions of the sea made movement easier and more predictable. Some researchers suggest that this timing reflects practical adaptation to environmental patterns, while others believe it also carried cultural significance, marking the beginning of daily cycles in a quiet and intentional way. The exact reasoning may vary. You pause and look out across the water again. The ships remain steady, their movement unchanged, but now their outlines are clearer, their shapes more defined. The lights that once marked their presence begin to fade as the growing light of the sky takes over. You notice how the rhythm continues through this transition. Night does not interrupt movement. Day does not accelerate it. The flow remains consistent. You take a slow breath and the air feels fresh as it moves through you. The scent of salt returns more clearly, no longer softened by mist. The sound shifts slightly as well. The water remains steady, but there is a subtle difference in how it feels, as if the space itself is becoming more open. At the same time, there are different interpretations about how daily cycles influence maritime activity in earlier periods. Some historians suggest that certain movements were timed carefully around daylight, taking advantage of visibility and conditions. Others propose that experienced sailors maintained steady travel regardless of time, relying on their familiarity with the environment. The understanding allows for both perspectives. You let that thought settle without needing to resolve it, because here what mathematics is the continuity. The sense that movement does not depend on any single moment. It carries through all of them. You imagine the shoreline as it will appear in full daylight. More visible, more detailed, but not fundamentally different. The same paths, the same structures, the same steady presence of life beside the water. A small but interesting detail appears in some accounts describing how people living near the coast often develop a quiet awareness of these transitions, sensing the approach of morning before it is fully visible through subtle changes in air, light and sound. Some researchers interpret this as a deep familiarity with the environment, while others believe it is a natural human response to gradual shifts in light. You take another slow breath and the air feels balanced. The sky continues to lighten. The water reflects it softly, and the ships continue their passage, now moving through a space that is slowly becoming day. You stand there for a moment longer, letting this transition settle into your thoughts. Night giving way to morning. Darkness to light, but without urgency, without disruption, just a gentle unfolding. And as your thoughts follow that quiet change, they begin to slow once more. Not holding on to the night, not reaching for the day, just resting within the space between them. You remain by the shoreline, and as the first light of morning continues to spread gently across the sky, everything begins to feel more defined. Not sharper in a harsh way, just clearer. The horizon stretches with quiet certainty, the water reflecting soft tones of pale blue and faint gold. The ships are still there moving as they always have, but now their shapes are easier to follow, their paths more visible. And yet despite the growing light, nothing feels rushed. The rhythm remains the same. You take a slow breath and the air feels fresh, carrying a subtle warmth that was not present before. The night has not disappeared suddenly, it has simply faded into this new moment. You stand still, watching the movement across the strait, and something begins to settle within your awareness. A quiet balance, movement and stillness existing together. The ships continue their steady passage one after another, their presence forming a gentle line that stretches across the water. At the same time, the shoreline remains calm, grounded, unchanged in its quiet presence. These two experiences do not compete, they coexist. A widely accepted observation shows that places defined by constant movement often develop a surrounding stillness that allows that movement to feel balanced rather than overwhelming. The environment adapts not by resisting change, but by holding it within a steady frame. Here that balance is clear. You watch a vessel move slowly across the water, its path uninterrupted, its motion smooth. It does not demand attention, it simply continues. And as it does, you notice how your own thoughts begin to follow a similar pattern. Not jumping, not shifting quickly, just moving gently from one moment to the next. A lesser-known detail from some accounts of maritime life suggests that individuals who spend long periods near steady, repetitive movement often begin to experience a sense of calm that is tied directly to that rhythm. Some researchers suggest that this reflects the human mind's ability to synchronize with consistent patterns, while others believe it may be influenced by the absence of sudden change or interruption. The exact cause may vary, but the feeling is clear. You take a few slow steps along the shoreline and the sand feels slightly warmer, now responding to the growing light. The air moves softly, no longer carrying the cool stillness of night, but not yet fully warmed by the day. Everything feels balanced. You look out again and the ships continue their passage unchanged by the transition from night to morning. Their movement remains steady, their ceasing consistent, their presence calm. There is something reassuring in that. A sense that not everything shifts with the light. At the same time, there are different perspectives about how environments like this shape human experience over time. Some historians suggest that constant exposure to steady movement and repetition can influence how people perceive time, making it feel more continuous and less divided. Others propose that individuals adapt in different ways, with some finding calm in repetition and others seeking variation. The understanding remains open. You let that thought pass without needing to hold on to it, because here what matters is not the explanation, it is the experience. The feeling of standing within a place where movement never stops and yet nothing feels hurried. You notice how the water reflects the sky more clearly now, the surface carrying soft light that stretches outward in gentle lines. The waves continue their steady motion unchanged by the shift from darkness to light. Everything continues. A small but interesting detail appears in some observations describing how experienced navigators often rely on both movement and stillness to guide their awareness, using the steady rhythm of their surroundings as a reference point. Some researchers interpret this as a refined form of environmental awareness, while others believe it is simply a natural adaptation to consistent conditions. You take a slow breath and the air feels light as it moves through you. The shoreline remains calm. The ships continue their passage, and the balance between movement and stillness holds everything together. You stand there for a moment longer, letting that balance settle into your thoughts. Not something that needs to be understood, just something that can be felt. A quiet harmony. Movement without urgency. Stillness without emptiness. And as your thoughts follow that gentle balance, they begin to slow once more, resting within the space where everything continues and nothing needs to change. You continue along the shoreline, and by now everything feels settled into a quiet completeness. The light rests evenly across the water. The air moves gently, neither warm nor cool. The strait beside you continues its steady motion, unchanged, familiar. There is nothing left to follow, only something to feel. You walk slowly, your steps soft against the ground, and you begin to notice how easily your movement blends into the rhythm of this place. You are no longer observing from a distance. You are moving with it. The water flows, the land remains, and you are somewhere in between. You pause, looking out across the strait one final time. The ships continue their quiet passage, their presence steady, their movement unbroken. They do not draw your attention in the way they once did. They are part of the whole. Across all the time you have moved through, from the earlier settlements to the quiet morning, now this narrow passage has remained what it has always been. A place of connection, a place of continuity, a place that allows movement without urgency. A broadly accepted understanding shows that certain waterways maintain their role across centuries, not because they resist change, but because they quietly adapt to it, holding together different moments in time within the same steady path. You take a slow breath and the air feels calm, balanced, easy. The shoreline stretches beside you, familiar now in a way that does not require attention. The sea moves, the ships pass, and everything continues. A small but interesting detail appears in some reflections on places like this, where individuals who spend time observing steady environments often begin to feel less separate from them, as if their thoughts begin to follow the same quiet patterns. Some researchers suggest that this reflects a natural alignment between human awareness and repetitive surroundings, while others believe it is simply the result of stillness allowing attention to soften. The explanation does not matter here. The feeling does. You take a few more steps, then slow, then stop. There is no reason to go further. Nothing left to reach. Only this moment, held gently between what has been and what will continue. And as you stand there, the quiet rhythm of the strait remains beside you, steady and unbroken, just as it has always been. You let your gaze rest on the water, not focusing on anything in particular, just allowing your awareness to settle into the movement. The waves move softly. The light stretches across the surface. The distant vessels continue barely noticeable now, and your thoughts begin to slow. Further. Softer! Like the tide itself moving in and out without effort. There is no need to follow anything, no need to understand anything more. Everything has already been shown. Everything continues. You take one last slow breath and the air feels quiet as it moves through you. The shoreline remains, the water remains, the rhythm remains, and you standing here have become part of it, not separate, not observing, just present. And as that feeling settles completely, your thoughts begin to drift even more gently, no longer following the movement, just resting within it, calm, still, unhurried. Word count 1152. The light has fully settled now. Morning rests softly across the water, but it carries none of the urgency that daytime often brings. Instead, it feels like a continuation of everything that came before. You remain where you are, or perhaps you imagine yourself sitting. Now the shoreline close, the sea stretching quietly beyond. The sounds are gentle, the movement steady. Nothing asks for your attention, nothing pulls you away. The ships continue their distant passage, but they are no longer something to follow. They are part of the background, part of the rhythm that holds everything together. You notice your breathing, slow, even matching the quiet movement of the water. The air feels soft as it moves in and out, carrying a calm that does not need to be held onto. It simply exists. Your thoughts, once moving from one idea to another, begin to settle, not stopping, just softening, like the waves that reach the shore, then gently return. There is nothing left to explore, nothing left to trace, only this quiet presence. You let your awareness rest here between land and sea, between movement and stillness, where everything continues without needing to change. And as you remain in that space, your body relaxes a little more. Your thoughts drift a little further. The world becomes quieter, softer, more distant, until even the rhythm of the water fades into something gentle and far away, and you simply rest. You still rest. End of script, sweet dreams.